Chapter 27:32. Then, the World Founders watched helplessly as the clones of the World Founders plunged into the world of laws behind them and entered many parallel locations that were completely different from their clones. "Looks like we've really walked right into the trap." One of the World Founders smiled bitterly. Those World Founders who returned had obtained some things before they plunged their clones into the world of laws. Yet, they took the initiative to ask for it. Not only did they not receive any compensation, but they even had to pay a favor. How could they feel balanced with such a huge difference? However, it was clear that what was done could not be undone. At this time, they couldn't even complain too loudly. Otherwise, they would have to bear the consequences. At this time, many clones continuously plunged into the parallel worlds and began to cause more and more profound effects on the parallel world. After all, the flow of time in the world of laws was hundreds of millions of times faster than the flow of time in the transportation network layer in the outside world. With such a rapid flow of time, an instant in the outside world would probably be tens of thousands of years inside. With the wisdom of those world founders, such a long time was long enough for them to regain their strength and start to stand out in the parallel world. And this was already enough to cause all kinds of profound effects on the parallel world. At this time, in the many worlds that had just entered the transportation network layer, or rather, returned to the transportation network layer, the heavens will incarnations of the world of laws began to take over the highest authority of those worlds and began to control the corresponding changes in those worlds to resist the great tribulations of the world that those worlds encountered. For those world founders, the great tribulations of the world were something they couldn't bear, and they had no choice but to seek help from the outside to have a chance to survive. But for the heavens will incarnations, such tribulations were simply at the level of elementary school students. Based on what they had seen in the first and second great tribulations of the world, the first great tribulations of the world that those worlds encountered were really not worth mentioning. They were well aware of how to deal with it, and even what method they should use to deal with it in the best way to deal with it with the least amount of losses. At this time, they didn't even need to explore much. They just needed to take out the methods from their memories, and they would be able to deal with these tribulations perfectly. As a result, the effects of the tribulations in those worlds were quickly weakening. In fact, some of the lands that were in better conditions instantly reversed the situation of the world, allowing the world to instantly break free from the tribulation. The entire world began to rapidly change for the better. The pioneers were naturally dumbfounded at the sight of this. Although the authority possessed by the incarnation of the heavenly axiom was said to be the highest authority in the world. However, in the end, it was only the authority granted by the Creator of the world. No matter how one looked at it, this kind of authority could not compare to the authority that the Creator of the world had. This also meant that the heavenly axiom incarnation's control over the world, the mobilization of the world's power, and the manipulation of the world's laws were definitely incomparable to the Creator of the world. Even so, under such circumstances and with the authority that was far inferior to their own, the Heavens Will avatars had achieved what they could never have done. They had easily suppressed the calamity that they could never have resisted. How could the pioneers of heaven and earth not be shocked by that? Am I not the Creator of heaven and earth? Then, they are? In that instant, many of the pioneers had such doubts in their hearts. After all, this change had exceeded their understanding. It was clearly their own world and their own body, but someone else's control over the world and the body was actually stronger than theirs. With the help of the world and the body, they could do more than they could. No matter how they looked at it, this situation was unacceptable. As the pioneers of heaven and earth were shocked, the heavenly axiom incarnation quickly suppressed the various tribulations. Although those heavens and earth were still in the tribulation and the tribulation was still destroying those heavens and earth, there were still endless tribulations pouring into those heavens and earth. However, all these changes were completely hidden in the depths of the world under the control of the heavenly axiom incarnation. In other words, it was hidden out of the range of the living beings' perception. To the living beings of this world, the world had unknowingly returned to normal. At most, there were a few more strange lights flickering everywhere than before the tribulations. If the pioneers of heaven and earth were only ordinary cultivators of this world, and their vision was only limited to the appearance of the world, they would definitely feel that the world had already passed the tribulations. However, it was obvious that the pioneers were not ordinary cultivators of this world. Their vision was naturally not limited to the appearance of the world, nor could it be limited to the various changes that were happening on the surface of the world. Under such circumstances, they could tell with a single glance that the power of the various tribulations that were still wreaking havoc in this world was still present. They could clearly see how the heavenly axiom incarnation resisted the power of the tribulations and protected their world with unimaginable ingenuity. It was also because of this that they became even more wary of the heavenly axiom incarnation. This method of lifting something heavy as if it were light had completely surpassed the limits of their imaginations. The extremely terrifying power of the tribulations that made their bodies tremble was actually so powerless in the hands of the heavenly axiom incarnation. It was actually so easy for the heavenly axiom incarnation to completely neutralize it. Everything seemed to be in a natural balance. They couldn't help but imagine what would happen if the heavenly axiom incarnation used this method on them. If the heavenly axiom incarnation didn't target the power of the tribulations and instead targeted them, what would happen to them? When they thought of this possibility, they couldn't calm down. Even if the authority that the heavenly axiom incarnation possessed was given by them, they couldn't feel at ease at all. The idea of going against the contract and looking for loopholes in the contract had unknowingly disappeared. It turned out that they didn't dare to resist or break the contract because the contract was tied to the tribulations. They weren't absolutely confident that they could break the contract without triggering the tribulations. In fact, they still wanted to look for loopholes in the contract and find an opportunity to break the contract. But now, after witnessing the means of the heavenly axiom incarnation, they no longer dared to have such thoughts. At this moment, even if the loopholes in the contract were placed in front of them and they only needed to take a step forward to easily break the contract, there were already very few founders who dared to take that step. This was because there were already very few founders who had the confidence to resist the heavenly axiom incarnation. Perhaps they were thinking of some means to break free from the restrictions of the contract so that it could no longer shackle them. But what about after breaking free from the shackles of the contract? Would Luo Fan have no reaction at all? If Luo Fan had any reaction, he would only need to send an incarnation of the heavenly way, and that would be enough to make him suffer. With such worries, how could they dare to take the step to break the contract? Is the heavenly axiom really that powerful? If that's the case, should I create a heavenly axiom as well? Many founders had such thoughts in their minds at this moment. However, founders were still founders after all, and they weren't the kind of existences who would blindly go after seeing benefits. Although the heavenly axiom incarnation seemed so powerful and incredible, the drawbacks of the existence of the heavenly axiom still remained in their hearts. They didn't completely forget the drawbacks of the existence of the heavenly axiom just because they saw how powerful the heavenly axiom incarnation was. They didn't completely forget the drawbacks of the existence of the heavenly axiom just because they saw how powerful the heavenly axiom incarnation was. In this way, before the drawbacks and hidden dangers were completely resolved, no matter how tempted they wouldn't easily take action to create the heavenly axiom incarnation in their own world. And with the desire for the heavenly axiom, their thoughts were transmitted to their incarnations, allowing their incarnations to gradually have one more goal in the world of laws. Or rather, the situation where they originally had no other goal apart from completing the contract had unknowingly changed. They began to have another goal apart from completing the contract, and that was to understand the mysteries of the heavenly axiom in the world of laws. It would be best if they could fully understand what method Luo Fan used to avoid the hidden dangers of the heavenly axiom and prevent it from eventually developing to the point where it would become an obstacle to the world. This wasn't easy. After all, the heavenly axiom was a high and mighty existence in the world of laws, and it was an illusory existence. Normally speaking, it was completely hidden, and there weren't any traces of it. It was extremely difficult to come into contact with the heavenly axiom and understand the various restrictions that might exist in it. Not to mention, it was even more difficult to find the secrets of the heavenly axiom and understand the various restrictions that might exist in the heavenly axiom. It was conceivable that this would be an extremely huge project. If they wanted to really achieve such a goal, the time they needed to spend would be countless times more than they had originally imagined. And in order to achieve such a goal, their actions naturally had to be more proactive than before. And the more proactive actions they took, the more changes that would occur in parallel to the world would naturally be triggered. In the end, the impact that would be triggered would also become even greater. Luo Fan, who was in the source of the world of laws, instantly felt that the changes that were triggered by the many parallel existences that were different from the natural evolution of the world of laws had increased by tens of thousands of times. Many things that required one to put in a lot of effort to comprehend even a tiny bit of it were now easily sensed at this moment. Under such changes, the process of his observation and search had become thousands of times easier than before. It's indeed useful. Sensing this change, Luo Fan secretly rejoiced. For the creators of the world, what they obtained was the heavenly axiom incarnation that assisted their world in surviving the great calamity of the world. What they paid was merely an incarnation that had no power or even the essence of the world itself. The difference between the effort and the gain was rather huge, and it could almost be considered a huge gain. However, compared to Luo Fan, what he paid was only the heavenly axiom incarnation, which was a small incarnation that the heavenly axiom had casually created. In return, his observation work had become thousands of times easier. The difference between the effort and the gain was similarly huge. If one were to calculate it, it could also be considered a huge gain. For Luo Fan, the heavenly axiom incarnation didn't need to pay anything to help the world survive the calamity. On the contrary, it could even allow the heavenly axiom to accumulate experience in dealing with the calamity. Hence, there was naturally no loss at all. Moreover, apart from this, he was even looking forward to it. If the heavenly axiom incarnation helped the world survive the calamity, how much of the benefits that the world would ultimately obtain would be obtained by his incarnation? Although this was just an unexpected gain, he wouldn't really care about it even if there wasn't one. However, there were still some benefits after all. From a certain point of view, this transaction could be regarded as a win-win situation. It was just that, relatively speaking, Luo Fan would win more. After tasting the sweetness of this deal, there was naturally no need to say more about what he should do next. Next, Luo Fan began to look at another nebula. This was the nebula that was formed by the second batch of worlds that had left the transportation network layer. Compared to the previous nebula, the number of worlds in this nebula was much lesser. Generally speaking, it wasn't even half of the worlds in the previous nebula. Generally speaking, it wasn't even half of the worlds in the previous nebula. It should be known that the second batch of worlds that had left the transportation network layer was tens or even hundreds of times more than the first batch. Chapter 2733. With the previous experience, it was naturally easier to pull the second batch of heavens and earths out of the transportation network layer back into the transportation network layer. In particular, the second batch of heavens and earths that broke away from the transportation network layer encountered tribulations that were stronger and more direct than the first batch. There were even avatars of tribulations involved, so their situation was much worse than the first batch. They naturally yearned for the olive branch that Luo Fan extended to them. If the first batch of heaven and earths were said to be somewhat reserved and would conceal their actions, Then the second batch of heaven and earths didn't even bother to conceal their actions. They completely abandoned everything and clung onto the olive branch that Luo Fan extended to them. As a result, the transportation network layer grew even faster than before. Of course, along with this growth came chaos. Compared to the first batch of heavens and earths that entered, it was even more intense and uncontrollable chaos. Faced with such a situation, the experienced Luo Fan directly took the same action as before. He let the Heavenly Tao once again split out the Heavenly Tao's incarnation to head to those worlds, sign contracts with them, and then take over the work of resisting the tribulations. In just a few short hours, the scene that many of the pioneers of the world felt was spectacular appeared once again. Similarly, countless streams of light erupted from many heavens and rapidly gathered towards the central world of laws. In the blink of an eye, they had completely merged into it and followed in the footsteps of the previous heaven and earth's founders. Facing this situation, the heaven and earth's founders were already numb to it. Throwing heaven and earth's founders into it one after another had already made it hard for their worldview to remain stable. Even if something more exaggerated happened in front of them, they wouldn't be too surprised and wouldn't feel that it was impossible. What is he trying to do? The heaven and earth's founders were completely bewildered at this moment. They couldn't figure out what Luo Fan was trying to achieve. Perhaps he wants to cultivate? Another heaven and earth's founder guessed. For us, there's nothing else to do apart from cultivating, right? Of course, he's doing this for cultivation. Who doesn't know that? However, what kind of cultivation is it? Why do you need so many clones to assist you? That's the real problem, isn't it? Another creator said unhappily. For cultivators of their level, every word and action was a form of cultivation. Even if it was eating, drinking and cursing each other, even if it was the most ordinary moment of being in a daze, it was all cultivation. Since that was the case, whatever Luo Fan did, no matter what his objective was, there was definitely an element of cultivation in the end. In fact, it was all for the sake of cultivation. Not to mention Luo Fan, even if they were here, they could also be considered as cultivating in this way. If it was said to be for cultivation, then it was obviously suitable for any problem or any abnormality. It was suitable everywhere, which also meant that it was inappropriate to put it anywhere. The creator of heaven and earth was speechless. After all, this was the final answer he could come up with. To be able to figure all of this out without any clues was already very rare. As the heaven and earth's founders continued to send their clones into the world of laws, the tribulations encountered by the world itself began to gradually disappear under the means of the heavenly Tao's clones. Of course, at least on the surface, it seemed to be gradually disappearing. In the face of this situation, the heaven and earth's founders were inexplicably happy. They only felt that their previous efforts were completely worth it. Of course, since they were all heaven and earth's founders, their mentality was naturally similar. The various psychological changes that occurred to the first batch of heaven and earth's founders naturally also appeared in the hearts of the second batch of heaven and earth's founders. Similarly, the heaven and earth's founders also began to give some new orders to their clones in the world of laws, allowing their clones to begin exploring the secrets of the heavenly Tao that existed in parallel. So it's you guys. At a certain moment, one of the second batch of heaven and earth's founders discovered the first batch of heaven and earth founders. In an instant, he was enraged. With a roar, his figure directly rushed out of his world, and with endless terrifying power, he fiercely collided with the first batch of heaven and earth founders. Boom, boom, boom. The heaven and earth creator collided with the heaven and earth, instantly creating an incredible movement and forming an unimaginable shockwave. The entire transportation network seemed to be shaken by the sound waves and shockwaves, and it seemed to be shaking violently. Are you crazy? The attacked heaven and earth founder was inexplicably angry at this time. At this time, although they had slightly escaped from the tribulations, they had barely escaped. Moreover, they were now in an extremely delicate state of balance. Perhaps if they were not careful, things would repeat in such a situation, in such a dangerous state. Fighting? This was simply putting their lives on the edge of a knife. It was precisely because he knew this that the Heaven and Earth founder felt even more incredulous at this time. He couldn't understand why the other party would start attacking him at this time. If you hadn't lied to us, how could so many of us have died? Why are all of you injured now? The attacking Heaven and Earth founder continued to attack the world crazily at this time without a care. No matter what, Heaven and Earth founders were still Heaven and Earth founders. If their realms were really divided, they were all at the level of tribulation experts. With such a level, there was no need to say anything more about his destructive power. At this moment, that part of the world was really like plasticine under the attack. It constantly deformed, and its structure was constantly being destroyed. There were also countless fragments of the world, fragments of the world, fragments of laws, and fragments of the laws of the world constantly splattering in all directions under the attack. Some of them even turned into all sorts of ripples and sound waves that spread out in all directions, affecting the nearby heavens and earth, causing those heavens and earth to tremble continuously. If the incarnation of the heavenly axiom wasn't controlling everything and helping those worlds resist the tribulations, this kind of movement alone was enough to make hundreds of worlds completely sink and collapse in the tribulations. Of course, this was the impact of the aftermath of the world. For the world that was directly attacked by the attack of the Heaven and Earth founder, the situation was obviously different. Although that world was directly controlled by the incarnation of the heavenly axiom to help it resist the tribulations, it was not omnipotent. All the abilities of the incarnation of the heavenly axiom could only be used on that world. If it was purely relying on the incarnation of the heavenly axiom, perhaps it could be equivalent to a relatively powerful cultivator, but it definitely could not resist a complete world. Under such circumstances, the impact and destruction caused by the direct attack of the world founder on that world was not something that the incarnation of the heavenly axiom could completely suppress. At this time, the entire balance of the world had been completely broken. The tribulations that were barely suppressed began to expand rapidly, and in just a short period of time, they had completely devoured the entire world. As the entire world was devoured by the tribulations, it looked like it had turned into a ball of fire, and it looked like it had completely lost the appearance of a world. You deserve to die. The world founder was furious at this moment. At this moment, he completely understood why the world founder attacked him, and in the depths of his heart, he also felt that the other party had a reason to attack him. However, all of this did not mean that he was willing to accept the other party's attack, nor did it mean that he was willing to give up his life under the other party's attack. After all, he did not think that he was in the wrong. Moreover, even if he was in the wrong, there was no need for him to pay with his life. The reason why the creator of this world attacked this world was because he recognized that the creator of this world was someone who had deliberately tricked him in the past. Back then, he had once discovered the abnormality of this world founder and knew that they were connecting. However, when he went to ask, the world founder pretended that nothing had happened. In the end, he even came up with a specious theory to mislead him. In the end, he did not catch up with the first batch of worlds that had left the transportation network. Instead, it caused the second batch of worlds to make a choice when they left the transportation network. This caused the second batch of worlds to be even more determined to fuse together when they left the transportation network. In the end, they attracted the incarnation of the tribulations, causing the second batch of worlds to suffer losses that were thousands of times greater than the first batch of worlds. To the first batch of world founders, they did not think that this loss had anything to do with them. After all, this was only the choice of the second batch of worlds, and it was because they did not have enough skills, knowledge, and strength. However, for the second batch of world founders, the situation was obviously different. To them, the first batch of heaven and earth founders was just using them as a shield. Back then, they clearly only needed to be notified so that they could react at the last moment and join the first batch of worlds to leave the transportation network. But in the end, for their own safety and to save themselves more trouble, they actually completely ignored them and treated them as scapegoats. This kind of behavior was unforgivable by any creator of the world. That was why the creator of this world would launch an attack on that world like a madman at this moment. In this situation, both sides felt that they were reasonable and that the other party was being unreasonable. Naturally, neither side would yield. As a result, the war between the first and second batch of world pioneers that had been stirred up by the creator of the world erupted in an instant. Of course, apart from a few unlucky worlds, most of the worlds remained intact in this war due to the existence of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao. Although they were not completely damaged, at least they were not completely destroyed. And the number of people participating in this war also kept increasing. In the beginning, it was only a small portion, but in a short period of time, it had already expanded to the point where it involved all the worlds. However, the creators of the world were not ordinary living beings. It was their instinct to find hope in the worst of situations. Thus, even if they had no experience of going through tribulations, the creators of the world also quickly responded accurately. Almost all of the world founders who were unlucky enough to be destroyed by the world's attack managed to escape the fate of being destroyed along with the world at the last moment. They left the world and lived in the transportation network layer as a world founder who had lost the world. When they finally completely left the world and existed in the transportation network, the world founders were both furious and glad. They were furious that their world could not withstand the tribulations in the end and was completely destroyed. On the other hand, they were glad that they had finally returned to the transportation network layer. If they had not returned to the transportation network layer, they would have probably been lost in the boundless simulated state of chaos. In fact, they might not even have had the chance to be lost, and would have directly perished along with the tribulations, their souls dispersing. As for why they would be lost in the boundless simulated state of chaos, the reason was actually very simple. It was because if they were not in the transportation network layer, once their world collapsed, even if they could escape, they could only be completely immersed in the simulated state of chaos. It was just like when Luo Fan first entered the simulated state of chaos. He could not even sense his own body, let alone anything else. In this way, with the conditions of the founders of the world, they might be able to survive in the simulated state of chaos. However, it would be impossible for them to sense anything else. They would not even be able to sense their own bodies, and it would be impossible for them to know if they were still alive. They would obviously be completely lost in the simulated state of chaos. This kind of loss would naturally not be permanent. When they opened up their own world again, this situation could still be changed. However, by that time, no one knew how much time had passed in the universe. Chapter 2734. In the blink of an eye, billions of trillions of years had passed in the simulated state of chaos. This was obviously unacceptable to ordinary world founders. They weren't Luo Fan, and they weren't sure that the simulated state of chaos wouldn't be destroyed because of their absence. To them, the existence and disappearance of this simulated state of chaos were random. Perhaps this simulated state of chaos was still extremely prosperous at this time, but in the next moment, it would completely disappear due to some changes. If this kind of change happened in a time when even his own body couldn't sense it, then wouldn't losing his senses be equivalent to death? As for why Luo Fan could be sure that this simulated state of chaos wouldn't change in this state, the reason was actually very simple. Because this simulation of the primal chaos was born from his seventh Great Tribulation. In this case, as long as he didn't pass his seventh Great Tribulation, this simulated state of chaos would never disappear. Even if he was in a state where he couldn't perceive the outside world or even his own body, this conviction wasn't blind. Even though this simulated primal chaos state had already become independent since its birth, and was no longer affected by the outside world, even the great calamity could no longer directly distort the laws of this simulated primal chaos state to deal with Luo Fan. However, it was absolutely unavoidable to ensure that this simulated state of chaos would continue to exist before it dealt a fatal blow to Luo Fan. Otherwise, why would Luo Fan need to construct a world of laws to communicate with this simulated state of chaos? Wouldn't it be fine if he directly fell into that state of confusion? In any case, this simulated state of chaos might end when he was in that state of confusion. In that case, wouldn't he just have to maintain this state until he came back to his senses? After all, if this simulated state of chaos disappeared, it would mean that he had already passed this tribulation. Obviously, there wouldn't be such an obvious loophole in the seventh great tribulation for him to take advantage of. The world founders rejoiced, but it wasn't the same for the world founders who attacked them. They wanted to attack those worlds because they were unhappy with the world founders. They wanted to see the world founders suffer losses, and it would be best if the world founders perished as well. Now, the worlds of the world founders were destroyed, but what about themselves? They didn't even have to pay any price. How could the attackers accept such an outcome? As a result, the attackers were still unyielding. They turned their gazes towards the world reformers and began to attack them. As the creator of the world, even the weakest among them were in the tribulation realm. If such an expert were to launch an attack recklessly, the impact it would cause would be unimaginable. In an instant, the entire transportation network layer began to churn crazily. Boundless energy was constantly stirred. Even the traffic roads were constantly being broken and rebuilt. All sorts of terrifying disturbances caused the founders of the world to gradually become solemn. In the end, when the first world creator was accidentally destroyed, Luo Fan had no choice but to act. One must know that the world pioneers were all resources that could help him cultivate and help him understand the laws of the world. The loss of any one of these resources was unacceptable to him. At that moment, he could only send out the heavenly Tao of the world of laws and let the heavenly Tao take action and suppress all the world founders who were fighting in the transportation network layer. After suppressing all the world founders, the heavenly Tao said faintly, "Master won't care about the battles between the worlds, but no lives can be lost." At that moment, the entire transportation network layer fell silent. All the world founders looked at the heavenly Tao in disbelief. They looked at the seemingly ordinary heavenly Tao that they had looked down on and even regarded as a hidden danger. The power displayed by the heavenly Tao had already subverted their worldview. At this moment, they couldn't understand whether the world had changed or if they had been wrong in the past. It had to be known that there were tens of thousands of world founders fighting here. How strong would the combined power of so many world founders be? With such terrifying power, they even suspected that even if Luo Fan appeared in front of them, they would probably be able to suppress him directly. But now, right in front of them, the heavenly Tao that they had looked down on and even regarded as a hidden danger was easily suppressed without taking any action at all. In this instant, all the world founders felt as if they were being suppressed by billions of worlds. Even their bodies couldn't tremble, let alone make any other moves. This kind of terrifying suppressive force was completely unimaginable to them. At this moment, the heavenly Tao relaxed its suppression on them and just glanced at them coldly before returning to the world of laws. After their bodies were released from the suppression, the world founders looked at each other and couldn't react for a long time. Their original irreconcilable enemies seemed to have become less important at this moment. The hatred that they originally took very seriously and felt that they might never be able to forget for the rest of their lives seemed to have become insignificant. What are we? Are we ants fighting over an ant's nest? This was what the world founders thought at this moment. After discovering that they were just ants among ants in the eyes of a certain existence that could crush countless existences with a single finger, they felt that it was extremely lame to be entangled in that kind of hatred. "Do you still want to fight?" A world founder sighed and asked his opponent. "Not anymore. It's boring." His opponent sighed and turned to leave. The world founder, who was almost killed by the attack, opened his mouth but couldn't say a word. It turned out that he was enjoying a new lease of life after the calamity when his opponent suddenly came knocking on his door and attacked him without any regard for his own safety. In the end, his world lost its balance in the calamity, causing it to completely collapse and be destroyed. After that, he even suffered an attack from his opponent and almost died from the opponent's attack. To him, these changes could practically be considered as an unexpected calamity. At this moment, he was absolutely filled with rage and hatred towards his opponent who turned to leave. However, after witnessing the means of the heaven's will, even if he had such hatred and rage in his heart, he didn't dare to vent it. Not to mention that he couldn't defeat his opponent. So what if he could defeat his opponent? Could he resist the heaven's will? If the heaven's will made another move and wanted to suppress him, could he resist it? Therefore, in the end, he could only sigh. Of course, he also knew that his opponent's rage and hatred wasn't any less than his. After all, he seemed to be an enemy to the heaven's will too. What's going on? The creator of this world could only sigh in the end. He turned around and left, searching for a way to re-establish his own world. As for the situation of the world, he didn't want to care about it anymore. At this moment, not only did the battles between the world founders who had lost their world stop, but the world founders who targeted the world also stop. After all, to the attacking world founders, their goal was obviously the death of the world founders. But now, the death of the world founders was no longer possible. In this way, what was the point of destroying the world? Was it just to make the heavens will feel heartache? In order to make the heavens will feel heartache, was it really worth it to pay the risk of angering Luofan and possibly be suppressed by the heavens will? For a time, the chaos in the transportation network layer completely calmed down after the heavens will appeared to suppress it slightly. The entire transportation network layer seemed to have completely returned to the peaceful state that it was established in the beginning. The reason why the heavenly Tao was able to suppress so many founders so easily was naturally not because the heavenly Tao was so powerful that it could completely suppress them. In fact, the reason why it could do this was very simple. It was because Luofan was the ruler of the entire transportation network layer. Because Luofan was the master of this transportation network layer, he was able to control the entire transportation network layer, and he was able to control all the forces within this transportation network layer. This included the forces that the various worlds possessed. Just now, he had bestowed this power to the heaven's will, allowing it to control the power of the entire transportation network layer and the various forces of the world at will. Under such circumstances, the outcome of the world founders was imaginable. The entire transportation network layer had tens of millions of worlds. With so many worlds, even if only 1% of the power of a world was controlled and used, it would still be an unbelievably astronomical figure when added up. With so much power, it was naturally difficult to attach it to a single world creator. However, if he succeeded, then the results would obviously be inconceivable. Clearly, for the heaven's way that had complete control over all changes in the world, it was clearly a small matter for it to transfer all of its power to the creators of the world. Therefore, the final outcome was what the world's founders saw. Is the heavens will really be that useful? This was the doubt that arose in the hearts of the world founders. At this moment, all the world founders that had entered the transportation network layer had sent their clones into the world of laws. After having such thoughts, one could imagine what their clones would choose. For a time, the changes in the many parallel worlds in the world of laws became more and more intense. The entire parallel world seemed to be producing great changes that affected the world every time it appeared, and the entire world seemed to be caught in a storm of changing dynasties. Under such circumstances, the changes caused by these parallel worlds were tens of thousands of times richer than before. These changes made Luo Fan very happy. After all, the greater the changes in the world, the more characteristics it would reveal. The more special traits there were, the more possible weaknesses and hidden dangers there would be. What he wanted to find, the various hidden dangers and effects that the other worlds carried on his world of laws, had yet to be found. However, what he didn't want to find, at least not at this time, the abnormalities that he had made up for in the missing parts of the world of laws, were constantly highlighted and found by him. It could be said that this was an unintentional gain. After discovering this, although Luo Fan wasn't very satisfied, he was still somewhat comforted. The ideas that he had used to fill in the blanks were merely constructed from his imagination and the ideas, experiences, and thoughts that he had grasped in the past. These supplements were obviously not perfect, and could even be said to be extremely crude. Such a crude concept was obviously just a kind of impurity in his view of the world. However, these impurities were obviously necessary. Without these impurities, his world of laws wouldn't be a perfect world of laws. There would be huge flaws, and it wouldn't be perfect no matter how he looked at it. Therefore, in order to complete his world of laws and turn it into a truly perfect world of laws, what he could do was to polish these impurities as much as possible and constantly sublimate them. In the end, these impurities would become perfectly compatible with his world of laws, perfectly compatible with his world of laws, and perfectly compatible with himself. Only in this way could he finally obtain a perfect world of laws. And in order to achieve this, his previous idea was to compare the endless worlds that existed in this simulated chaotic state with the other heavens and world. Chapter 27:35. Through the many parallel worlds, the influence of the incarnations of the world founders on the parallel worlds, the transformation of the parallel worlds, and the interaction between the parallel worlds and them, the various concepts that he had made up for had to endure the test again and again. All sorts of changes that would normally take an endless amount of time to appear were constantly being displayed. This kind of display played an extremely strong role in testing him. The weaknesses and strengths of the concepts that he had made up for were all displayed. This caused the omissions and flaws that could only be discovered by comparing the scenes of countless other worlds to be revealed. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was naturally secretly delighted. He had yet to obtain any real gains, but just the gains in front of him were already worth it for him to make such arrangements. There are indeed some places that a person can't touch when cultivating alone. I've made a mistake before. At this moment, Luo Fan recalled his various experiences in the previous few great tribulations. During those great tribulations, he seemed to have regarded the various living beings and wisdom that were born in those tribulations as aids to his cultivation. Perhaps it was because of this that he had been able to pass those great tribulations so smoothly. But this time, after entering the simulated primal chaos state, he focused more of his attention on himself. As for the other living beings, he would at most divide them into different camps. Most of the time, he would still treat them as his enemies. Perhaps it was because of this choice that his cultivation speed after entering the seventh Great Tribulation was much slower than the previous few Great Tribulations. At the very least, if he had entered the Great Tribulation for such a long time in the previous few Great Tribulations, he would have undergone a qualitative transformation. But this time, he had only managed to grasp a few clues and a few paths. Thinking of this, he looked at the boundless world in the sky with a slightly different gaze. Originally, he only regarded them as some kind of comparison that he could use, but now, it was as if he was looking at countless wonderful resources that could assist his cultivation and allow him to make a huge leap. There are so many worlds and so many world founders. If I get all of them, how much smoother would my cultivation be? This thought slowly emerged in his mind. He swept his perception across his world of laws. However, the vast majority of the countless parallel planes that existed in this world were still empty. Of course, this empty meant that there was no avatar of the world's creator that had entered, and it did not mean that there was nothing inside. Now, only a small portion of the parallel plane had the incarnation of the creator of the world entering it to cultivate and survive, and it had already brought him such great benefit. If all the parallel universes were filled and the incarnations of the world's founder entered all of them, how much benefit would he gain? With that thought in mind, he became even more determined to pull the clones of the other world founders into the world. However, it was clear that the pioneers of the other worlds were not the ones who had betrayed the transportation network layer. They did not let Luo Fan get hold of their weakness. The fact that Luo Fan didn't have a handle on them meant that he had to think of more ways to make them do what he wanted. However, he could no longer force him as violently as before. It's best if it's a win-win situation. As this thought appeared in his mind, all kinds of thoughts, methods, and possibilities appeared in his mind. It wasn't difficult for him to contact those worlds. Even though the heavens and earths were distributed in a boundless simulation of the primal chaos, there was an incomparably deep and profound simulation of the primal chaos between the heavens and earths. After all the worlds were closely connected to the tribulation layer. Even if there was no connection now, there would definitely be some connection in the future. All the worlds were connected to the tribulation layer, so as long as one passed through the tribulation layer, one would naturally be able to contact those countless worlds. Of course, this was the foundation and the principle. It was the possibility for Luo Fan to contact those worlds. However, it did not mean that Luo Fan could easily contact those worlds now. At least, his understanding of the tribulation layer was still limited to this level, and he could not easily contact those worlds with the help of the tribulation layer. However, this was, after all, a method and a possibility in front of him. As long as he knew this method and this possibility, he would be able to continue moving forward. In the end, it was only natural that he would reach his goal. Even if it took a lot of effort to sense the changes occurring in the many parallel worlds, it was not impossible for Luo Fan to analyze the foundation of the tribulation layer and find a way to contact other worlds through it. In fact, when he had the idea of establishing a connection with other worlds and achieving a win-win situation with them, he had already diverted some of his attention to deduce how to do this. To deduce it, he naturally needed conditions and information. Obviously, to him, there was too much information on how the tribulation level worked. Not to mention anything else, at this moment, the many Heaven's Path clones were fighting against the tribulation layer in the many world. As long as he was willing, he could obtain any information he wanted through the Heaven's Path clone. The situation was different in different worlds. The tribulations that one would encounter in different worlds would naturally be different as well. Even if this was only the first Great Tribulation. At this moment, the tens of millions of worlds were completely controlled by the Heaven's Path clone. This was equivalent to the Heaven's Path clone grasping the conditions to test the power of the tribulation layer. The power of the tribulation layer. This was equivalent to tens of millions of experts working together to study a difficult problem. Although quantity was not an absolute advantage, it did not mean that quantity could defeat everything. However, one had to admit that quantity was still a considerable advantage. With enough quantity, most problems would no longer be problems. The mystery of the level of tribulations in front of him, and the fundamental characteristic of the level of tribulations, was clearly one of those problems that could be solved by quantity. After all, what Luo Fan wanted to explore now was not the true origin of the tribulation layer, nor the true mystery of the tribulation layer. It was just a part of the mystery of the tribulation layer that he could come into contact with. This part of the mystery was something that he had experienced before. In terms of level, it was not something that he could not understand. Under such circumstances, as long as there were enough test subjects and enough tests, he would naturally be able to greatly reduce the difficulty of obtaining the answer to the question. Time passed slowly. Before he knew it, another 10,000 years had passed. Of course, these 10,000 years were 10,000 years in the transportation network layer. For Luo Fan's world of laws, the passage of time was probably billions of trillions of years. For those world founders, such a long period of time was long enough for them to explore the parallel world they were in, and there was even nothing new to touch and explore. But for Luo Fan, such a long period of time was only enough for him to reach the preliminary conclusion he wanted. The conclusion that belonged to a certain fundamental principle of the tribulation layer for Luo Fan, who had long surpassed time. The passage of time that was calculated in billions of trillions of years was only about the same as an instant. This bit of time was not enough to leave a trace in his heart. As time passed, Luo Fan still looked exactly the same as before. One couldn't even see the slightest difference between him and the way he was back then. In contrast, the world founders did not have such an ability. After such a long period of time, the world founders had more or less changed. Among them, the most obvious changes were annoyance and numbness. Annoyance and numbness towards the world of laws. Because they could only be in the world of laws for countless years, and they could only be in a certain parallel world in the world of laws, they fell into boredom and numbness after exploring that place and feeling that they were already standing at the peak of that parallel world and exploring all the mysteries of that parallel world. Of course, there might be some world founders who still remembered their original goal, which was to find the meaning of the existence of the heavenly Tao. However, they were only the minority among the minority. After all, not everyone could maintain the mood to explore a problem that they had worked hard for billions of trillions of years to no avail and felt no different from when they first entered it. Their understanding of the problem was not much deeper than before, and not everyone could maintain the mood to explore it. Evidently, the same logic applied to the world founders as well. However, all of this didn't matter to Luo Fan. He didn't care much about the numbness and annoyance of the world founders. Occasionally, when he was in a good mood, he would directly transfer some world founders who performed too poorly to a parallel world and let them start over again. After all, there were too many parallel worlds in the world of laws for him. Even if he transferred them so casually, he could transfer them for countless years. However, this was obviously not so wonderful for the world founders. The first few times were fine, as each transfer represented a new start, which meant that they could encounter new challenges and new changes. But after a few times, as things became more and more repetitive, and as the scenes became more and more repetitive, their numbness could no longer be shaken by this transfer. In fact, some world founders' incarnations even had thoughts of committing suicide. Of course, this kind of suicide in the world of laws was naturally completely controlled by Luo Fan. As long as Luo Fan didn't want them to die, Luo Fan could resurrect them even if they destroyed themselves completely to the point where there was not a trace of them left. After trying this dozens of times, the world founders naturally lost interest in doing it. Due to the influence of the laws of heaven and earth, the entire transportation network layer was now a completely different world compared to 10,000 years ago. It was a completely different place. The hope of vitality from back then no longer existed. Currently, all of the world founders were lifeless. "I can't take it anymore." On this day, a world founder roared and instantly slashed at himself. With this slash, the world founder seemed to have instantly let go of a heavy burden. His entire body suddenly felt relaxed, and his mental state instantly changed drastically. "I've finally gotten rid of it." At this moment, the world founder let out a long breath and felt as if he had come back to life. His actions instantly stunned many of the pioneers of the world. Immediately after, the world founders seemed to have woken up from a dream and began to take action one by one, using all kinds of methods to slash themselves. With this slash, all the world founders seemed to have come back to life in an instant. The atmosphere of the entire transportation network layer instantly changed because of this change, and in the blink of an eye, the original scene of vitality was restored. Why didn't I think of it earlier? If I had thought of it earlier, I wouldn't have had to suffer for such a long time. The world founders couldn't help but speak up at this moment. Each and every one of them had a look of regret on their faces. What exactly did they do? What did they mean by slashing themselves with a slash? It was none other than the fact that they had completely severed the connection between themselves and their clones just now. This severing allowed those clones to gain complete freedom at this moment. In other words, they had completely become a part of the world of laws. This was obviously a great loss for them. Those clones were a part of them, and could even be said to be replicas of them. Abandoning all of these meant that they had abandoned their replicas, the replicas that contained all of their secrets, principles, and mysteries of cultivation. This situation was a huge loss for any cultivator, as it meant that they had given away all of their secrets to others. Chapter 2736. This kind of loss was a loss that any world founder would never be willing to suffer until the very end. If it were any other time, these world founders wouldn't have made the decision to abandon their clones even if they encountered a great calamity and would die if they didn't abandon their clones. However, at this time, in the face of the terrifying flow of time in the world of laws and the outside world, and in the face of the madness, dullness, numbness, pain, and irritation transmitted by their clones, they finally couldn't bear it any longer. They brazenly severed their clones and completely abandoned them. This was enough to show how much the dullness, numbness, madness, pain, and irritation affected them. Of course, there was a major prerequisite for them to abandon their clones so decisively. Without this major prerequisite, they would probably rather destroy their clones than completely sever the connection between their clones and their main bodies, allowing their clones to become independent individuals in the world of laws. This major prerequisite was that there was a huge gap in strength between them and Luofan. This huge gap in strength made their own secrets, the mysteries of their cultivation, and the various trump cards they had hidden completely meaningless to Luofan. In other words, even if Luofan didn't know their various secrets and trump cards, he would still be able to easily get rid of them. If Luofan could do this, then their clones would be useless to Luofan. The secrets contained in their clones, as well as the various trump cards of their own cultivation, would naturally not become something that could be used against them. With this premise, they would decisively abandon their avatars and allow their avatars to turn into independent individuals to live in the world of law. When the world's founders severed the connection between their incarnations and their main bodies in the world of laws, the incarnations of the world's founders in the world of laws were stunned for a moment before an indescribable subtle change occurred in the mood of all the incarnations. For their main bodies, severing their clones was equivalent to abandoning a part of themselves. It was equivalent to giving up a copy of themselves. However, the situation was obviously completely different for these clones. For those incarnations, this kind of abandonment and severing was equivalent to giving them a new life. It was equivalent to giving them true independence and true freedom. One must know that although these clones were originally connected to the main body and could receive all sorts of support, resources, and information from the main body at all times, the clones were all connected to the main body. But at the same time, it also meant that they were under the control of the main body, causing them to be unable to have a sense of self and think independently. They seemed to be derived from another body, just like some organ outside of their body. In the past, these clones naturally wouldn't have cared about such a situation. After all, the avatar itself controlled the will of the main body. However, when their connection with their original bodies was severed, they began to feel an indescribable pressure. They felt that their previous living state was that of a slave. It was an extremely miserable living state. Now that they had gained independence and the connection between them and their main bodies had been completely severed, things were naturally different. In this way, they could finally be considered to have obtained freedom. They could finally be considered to have become real living beings from their original organs. The joy of being born, the satisfaction of being born out of thin air, and the excitement of obtaining freedom instantly filled the hearts of the clones of the world's creators. As these feelings emerged, the way the clones viewed the world around them gradually changed. Everything that was originally dull, boring, irritating, and even disgusting was now given a whole new meaning and color. Dullness, boredom, irritation, and disgust disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. At this moment, everything became so interesting, so novel, so fascinating. Although they had seen this scene for billions of trillions of years in their memories, and although they had experienced all sorts of experiences tens of thousands of times, the change in their perspective was completely different. It was like watching a movie and walking into the world of the movie. Originally, when they were just clones and had no autonomy, everything they experienced was like watching a movie. Everything they saw and experienced was indeed through their senses and bodies. However, what they ultimately received was still the main body and the will of the main body. What was the difference between this and watching a movie? Although this movie was a little more realistic, now that they had become independent individuals, all of their experiences and perceptions had become their own. This feeling, of course, was like walking into the real world of the movie. For anyone, no matter how many times they watched a movie, they would feel novel and excited when they really stepped into the world of the movie. As their mood changed, the atmosphere of the many parallel existences also began to change. Many parallel existences had been closely connected to the clones of the world's creators for billions of years. Even if the clones of the world's creators didn't become the rulers of these parallel existences, their footprints and influence would inevitably affect the entire parallel existences through various other methods. In the end, the entire parallel existences would change along with their changes. Under such circumstances, it was only natural for many parallel existences to change at this time. With this change, more mysteries began to appear in the parallel existences. The various hidden mysteries that had gradually turned into stagnant water were gradually stirred up again. This kind of change made Luo Fan feel very surprised. He didn't expect that the world's creators would cut off their clones. After all, the passage of time was actually meaningless to him. It wasn't enough to leave any traces in his heart and affect him much. Under such circumstances, he naturally wouldn't have expected that the terrifying flow of time would have such a huge impact on the world's creators. If he couldn't have expected this, he naturally wouldn't have expected that they would give up their clones to avoid this impact. However, when he saw the pioneers giving up on their clones, it only took him a moment to understand what they were thinking and what they were worried about. What an unexpected gain! Sighing inwardly, Luo Fan focused his attention on the countless worlds in the sky. The changes in the clones of the world's creators could indeed bring more motivation to the many parallel existences in the world of laws, produce more changes, and lead to more hidden secrets. However, these were secondary at this time. To him, the most important thing at this time was to find a way to contact the countless worlds in the sky and find a way to trick the world's creators over. Through the long years of research and sorting out, he had already obtained what he wanted. At this moment, the tribulation level was like an incomparably huge world in his eyes, and the countless worlds were like the countless stars under this world. Through this world, he could see countless channels connecting that world and the stars. The passageways were so real and solid that it felt as though he could directly descend to those stars through these passageways if he wanted to. Of course, this was just an illusion. He was very clear about this in his heart. The reason why he felt that the tribulation levels had changed was that he had a deeper understanding of the tribulation levels. He had a deeper understanding of the tribulation levels that might exist in the tribulation levels, or at least the tribulation passages of heaven and earth, for those who had survived the first and second tribulation of heaven and earth. Because this understanding had become more profound, the tribulation level in his eyes had changed, becoming more similar to the real thing. At the very least, it was realistic within the scope of his understanding. Those extremely solid channels were actually not the real tribulation channels, but the product of the integration of the tribulation channels and the connection between the tribulation level and the world. In other words, it could be said that this was the real way to contact the tribulation level and the world. The tribulation channels that Luo Fan had previously understood were actually just a form of this real way of contact, or rather, an image that was displayed from a certain point of view. It was because of the integration of the two that Luo Fan had the opportunity to use this connection to communicate with those worlds. After all, if it was a tribulation channel, he would definitely have to suppress the tribulation power in order to communicate with those worlds because of the existence of the tribulation power. At the very least, he would have to experience the cleansing of the tribulation power to finally be able to ignore the tribulation power. In that case, wouldn't every time he communicated with a world, wouldn't it be equivalent to going through a tribulation together with that world? It would be fine if there were only a few of such things, but if there were many worlds, like the endless worlds that were displayed in the boundless sky at this moment, even Luo Fan would not be willing to endure it. Only at this moment could he integrate the two so that although the channels contained the tribulation power, there would also be many empty spaces that would allow him to pass through the channels without coming into contact with the tribulation power, and that would allow him to easily communicate with the world creators of the other world. Of course, this sounded simple, but there were naturally many restrictions when it came to actually doing it. For example, the way to advance in the channels, the distribution of the tribulation power in the channels, the type of tribulation power, the degree of distortion of the empty spaces, and so on and so forth. Obviously, all of these had to be taken into consideration in order to pass through the channels. However, this was not a problem for Luo Fan. At least, compared to directly resisting the tribulation power and moving forward while being cleansed by the tribulation power, it was not a problem. It was precisely because of this that he dared to say that after this change, it would be easier to communicate with them. These worlds are just the right choice. The first batch of worlds to communicate with naturally needed to be chosen carefully. At this moment, after identifying the many worlds, Luo Fan had already chosen a batch of world. The principle of choosing a world was naturally to choose the worlds that he needed to communicate with the most. And now, among the endless worlds in the sky, which one of them needed the participation of external forces the most and needed him to communicate with them the most? Obviously, it was the worlds that were separated from the transportation network layer previously. In other words, the worlds that were experiencing the tribulation and were already in imminent danger, and could even completely collapse and be destroyed at any time. Only those worlds could turn to any doctor in a desperate situation and not really reject other worlds and world creators. They could give Luo Fan a chance to communicate with them, and would not attack Luo Fan the moment they saw him. And there were too many such worlds in the sky at this time. There were countless kinds of worlds in the sky, and there might also be countless kinds of encounters. There were even more worlds that had encountered the tribulation. In fact, Luo Fan would only be able to see them in such a clear manner when the world was truly facing a tribulation. Under such circumstances, it was really too easy to choose a heaven and earth that he could contact, communicate with, and not attack at the first instant. Soon, Luo Fan had already chosen a world as his first contact target. That world was currently undergoing the tribulation, the first great tribulation of the world. At least, from the outside, the tribulation that it was undergoing was similar to the tribulation that the first batch of worlds that had separated from the transportation network layer had undergone. Such a world was obviously the best contact target. With a thought, Luo Fan inserted his mind into the tribulation layer. The way he looked at the tribulation layer had already changed, and the connection between the tribulation layer and his own world had naturally also changed. At this time, the connection channel had already turned into the same channel. Chapter 27:37. At this moment, although the connection between the heaven and earth and the tribulation level was rather solid, it was extremely small. There wasn't even the slightest bit of tribulation power in it. It felt as if the tribulation level had established a direct path to the heaven and earth, a path that could accommodate any living being. Only someone like Luo Fan, who had a deep understanding of the tribulation level and the second tribulation level, could manifest such a path. If his understanding of the tribulation level was slightly lacking, he would not be able to find the path no matter how hard he tried. At this moment, Luo Fan did not dwell too much on the path. He immediately separated a heavenly Tao clone and charged into the tribulation level above through the path. The path was extremely mysterious. There was no concept of time or space in it. With just a thought from Luo Fan, the heavenly Tao clone had already passed through the path and entered the tribulation level. It felt as if it had transcended time and space. After the heavenly Tao clone entered the tribulation level, what it saw was not the endless power of the tribulation like what it saw outside. Instead, it was an unimaginably chaotic existence that seemed to be in a state of chaos. In this gray existence, there were all sorts of indescribable gaps that existed in the endless gray. As the gray existence constantly changed shape, it was constantly being born and destroyed. These gaps were none other than the faint connections between the many heavens and earth. Every existence was connected to each other. It was the same even in the endless world that was simulated in a state of chaos. However, in the state of chaos, this connection was completely concealed by the various characteristics of the simulated state of chaos. It would change as the Creator's understanding of the heaven and earth, the simulated state of chaos, and the other heavens and earth changed. Therefore, when the Creator was unaware of the existence of the many heavens and earth, this connection would not be reflected at all. When the Creator had a deep understanding of the other heavens and earth, this connection would be greatly strengthened. This connection was extremely subtle. Although the tribulation level itself was not within the scope of this connection, the tribulation level had a close connection with the other heavens and earth. It had all sorts of unimaginable effects on the other heavens and earth. In turn, the other heavens and earth also had a corresponding reaction to the tribulation level. This kind of reaction, convergence, and materialization had actually changed some of the structure of the tribulation layer. Therefore, in Luo Fan's understanding, this structure was the faintly discernible, constantly changing, and constantly appearing and disappearing in the tribulation level. The existence of this gap was the way for Luo Fan to pass through the tribulation level to reach the other world. At this moment, the area where the incarnation of the heavenly way was located was a gap that was manifested by the reaction of the world to the tribulation level. This gap was not considered big at this time. In fact, it was thousands of times narrower than other gaps. It felt like if the incarnation of the heavenly Tao wasn't so mysterious, it wouldn't have been able to exist in such a tiny space. However, compared to the other gaps, although this gap was narrow, it had an advantage that did not exist in other gaps. That was stability. It was unimaginably stable. It felt as if this place was a part of a stable and eternal world. No matter how the gray and hazy tribulations in the surroundings surged, raged, and struck, this extremely narrow space remained stable as before, and it didn't shake at all. In this situation, the incarnation of the heavenly way knew what was going on at a glance. The tribulation level didn't have the slightest effect on the world of laws now, so the world of laws naturally didn't have much reaction force on the tribulation level as well. Because there wasn't much reaction force acting on the tribulation level, the gap created by the reaction force of the realm of laws on the tribulation level was naturally extremely narrow. In contrast, the current world was unimaginably stable. Because it was not affected by the tribulation level's power, it could even exist forever and could not be damaged at all. In this way, the gap created by the connection between its existence and the tribulation level naturally could not be shaken at all. In contrast, the other gaps were obviously different. At this time, the worlds corresponding to those gaps were more or less interacting with the tribulation level. This kind of interaction was clearly harmful to those heavens and earth. Perhaps it would not be so coincidental that those worlds would perish and perish, but it would inevitably cause the situation of those worlds to change. This kind of change corresponded to the tribulation level. Obviously, the gaps corresponding to the worlds in the tribulation level began to shake, distort, change shape, be born and destroyed, become illusory, and become solid. The incarnation of the heavenly way took a deep breath and fixed his eyes on the gap corresponding to the world Luo Fan had chosen. Many of the gaps were intermittent. Some of the gaps were connected together, while some of the gaps were completely cut off. Obviously, the gap corresponding to Luo Fan's world and the gap corresponding to the world he had chosen would not be so coincidentally connected by a gap. In fact, it was impossible for the two to be directly connected. Unless the incarnation could withstand the endless power of the tribulation level and advance, obviously, if Luo Fan's main body was here, there would be some possibility. However, this was only the incarnation of the heavenly way. It was just one of the countless incarnations of the heavenly way that Luo Fan had created. How could such an incarnation of the heavenly way advance against the endless power of the tribulation level? Therefore, if the incarnation wanted to reach the target gap, it could only take a detour. Although the target gap wasn't directly connected to the gap corresponding to Luo Fan's world of laws, it didn't mean that it was alone. It didn't mean that there was no gap connecting to it. As a matter of fact, this kind of thing was completely impossible. The number of worlds in the simulated primal chaos state was simply too many. Among so many worlds, even if each world had its own unique characteristics, each world was an incomparably unique existence compared to the others. However, when the number of worlds increased, some similarities were inevitable. Obviously, a world that shared a common trait with this world must also exist. And with similarities, the connection would naturally be closer. Once the connection was closer, the final result would be that the gap corresponding to them in the tribulation level would begin to establish a connection, and the worlds that were connected to it would also have another kind of similarity with other worlds. This gap would also have a direct connection with other gaps. In this manner, he would be able to deduce the gap corresponding to Luo Fan's world of laws in the end. In other words, in the end, he would definitely be able to find a path that led to the target gap and come out. For the incarnation of the heavenly way, the calculation of complicated problems was almost instinctive. The connection between the gaps was incomparably complicated, and there were countless possibilities in each gap. But for the incarnation of the heavenly way, it only took a glance to calculate everything and find a stable path that led directly to the target gap. After the calculation was done, it was only natural for it to do what it should do next. In a flash, the heavenly Tao incarnation was already moving through the gaps, constantly shifting from one gap to another. This kind of thing naturally couldn't go smoothly. Those gaps were constantly changing. Perhaps they would still exist at this moment, but in the next moment, the gap would be completely crushed by the tribulation level's power and disappear without a trace. Perhaps it would reappear in the next moment, but it would establish a connection with the gaps of other worlds. In this way, it was obviously impossible for the incarnation of the heavenly way to advance along the same path without changing. During this journey, it needed to constantly deduce, calculate, and change its path at all times. Fortunately, it was the incarnation of the heavenly way, and it treated calculation as an instinct. It was an existence that could skip complicated calculations in an instant. Otherwise, just the time limit that it could stay in each gap would be enough for it to fall into a disaster. After all, every single gap was constantly changing, and it could collapse at any moment and be completely crushed by the boundless tribulation layers in the surroundings. Under such circumstances, it was obviously impossible for it to stop while it was calculating. It couldn't carefully deduce everything in the gap corresponding to the world of laws before moving forward. It needed to move forward at every moment, and it also needed to deduce at every moment. Only by combining the two perfectly could it truly move forward safely. Along the way, the incarnation wasn't completely smooth. There were dozens or hundreds of times when it almost couldn't escape when the gap disappeared. There were even a few times when it was so dangerous that it left half of its body in the gap, and it disappeared along with the gap in the endless tribulation levels. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan's real body took the risk, it would be a joke with his life. From this, it could be seen how correct Luo Fan was to treat the incarnation of the heavenly way as his own incarnation and enter the tribulation level. If it hadn't taken this step, it would have probably left the tribulation level and had to rest for a few decades before it could continue advancing. After stumbling and getting injured thousands of times and recovering thousands of times, the incarnation of the heavenly Tao finally arrived at the location of the target gap with great luck. After arriving here, the incarnation didn't have a chance to take a deep breath. It directly passed through the passage between the tribulation level and the world, and directly crashed into it. Compared to the gaps in the tribulation levels, although there were still endless tribulations in this passage, the gap was countless times larger. After the experience of trekking through the gaps of the tribulation levels, the heavenly Tao incarnation felt extremely carefree as he looked at the narrow passageway. He felt that this passageway was so wide that he could split the heavens and earth apart. It's really wide. If the passage in the tribulation levels was this wide, I wouldn't have to work so hard. At this moment, the incarnation couldn't help but sigh. After experiencing so many dangers in the tribulation levels, it had stimulated the emotions of the incarnation, causing it to be different from other incarnations of the heavenly way. It became more vivid and complicated. This passage also didn't have the concept of time and space. If it didn't need to choose a path, this passage would definitely pass through it in a flash, just like when the incarnation entered the tribulation level from Luo Fan's world of laws. However, even if it needed to choose a path, the passage needed almost no time. Although it took a certain amount of time and a certain process to complete in the will of the heavenly Tao's incarnation, from the outside, whether it was the target world or the world of laws far away in the transportation network layer, that process didn't require time at all. In other words, it only took a flash for it to pass through. If one looked at it from a macroscopic perspective, that passage didn't even need to go through any process at all. If one looked at it as a channel, it meant that the incarnation's back was still at the entrance, while its front had already appeared at the exit. For Luo Fan and the incarnation of the Heaven's Way, this passageway existed. However, for the other worlds and the other creators, it obviously didn't exist. It was the same for the world creators of this world. Therefore, after entering and leaving the passage, they didn't appear in the normal spacetime of this world. After entering this place, they appeared in an indescribable place. There was no time, no space, no rules, no laws, and it didn't even exist. At a glance, it was complete chaos in all directions. Boundless evil chi filled this place, making it seem as if this place was in a state of chaos to the extreme. Faced with this situation, the incarnation was at a loss. This situation wasn't what he had expected. Is this because of the tribulation, or is this world special to begin with? The incarnation thought. Please wait a moment. After the content is updated, the page needs to be refreshed to receive the latest update. NT. Chapter 2738. Very soon, the heavens will incarnation felt the surging power of the tribulations break through the chaos around him, and he entered a strange space and time. When he arrived here, he suddenly understood that the abnormality from before was due to both the tribulation and the uniqueness of the world. There's no starry sky. The place he appeared in was a strange world. There was a sky and a ground, but there wasn't the starry sky of the universe that Luo Fan was most familiar with. At this moment, the sky was like a boundless void. The ground was a strange land that floated in the void, or rather, a lump of mud. The entire world was not the orbiculous sky and square earth that Luo Fan was familiar with, or the void of the universe. Instead, it was a state that was in between the orbicular sky and the starry sky of the universe. The ground was very similar to the stars, but it was fundamentally different from the stars. The sky was similar to the starry sky, but it was fundamentally different from the starry sky. The various circumstances made this world appear extremely special, and the heavenly Tao incarnation was momentarily stunned. At this moment, the boundless power of the tribulations was like a river, constantly scouring the innumerable huge clumps of mud, causing them to be constantly worn down, crumble, and assimilate with the power of the tribulations. There were countless living beings inside and outside the mud, and there were countless strange terrains. Every lump of mud was a huge biosphere, and every lump of mud was a huge continent. In other words, it was a star that was tens of thousands of times larger than an ordinary star. At this moment, the heavenly Tao incarnation instantly sensed the location of the creator of the world. The creator of the world was not in a lump of mud. Instead, he was above the mud, deep in the void. Although the performance of this tribulation was extremely special, it was ultimately only the first great tribulation of the world. At this moment, the heavenly Tao incarnation did not change, no matter how the tribulation washed over it. In fact, it was as if he was swimming in an ordinary river. He could easily float up and down on the river of tribulations and wade through it. As such, the heavenly will incarnation slightly relaxed at this moment and passed through the tribulation river. He floated up and down and arrived at the end of the tribulation river, where the creator of the world was. At this moment, the creator was tightly entangled by the river of tribulations. The river of tribulations was like 100 rivers flowing into the sea, frantically converging towards the creator. It constantly compressed and condensed, completely sealing the creator in the power of the tribulations. It was as if the creator had turned into a mosquito trapped in amber. The creator of this world was unable to move at all. It was as if the creator of the world was using his own strength and essence to take on the strongest part of the world's tribulation in place of the world. After all, the creator of this world was the creator of this world. He had absolute authority in this world. This kind of absolute authority was enough for him to use any method to control this world at any time, control his position in this world, and control the pressure he endured in this world. To think that a creator of this world would make such a choice. This is truly an eye-opener. At this moment, the heavenly will incarnation sighed and appeared in front of the amber. He quietly looked at the creator of this world, who was sealed in the amber. This huge piece of amber was probably tens of millions of kilometers in circumference. Standing in front of the amber meant that the distance between the creator of this world and the one in the center of the amber was calculated in millions of miles. However, at this moment, the heavenly will incarnation was not worried that the creator of this world would not discover his existence or hear his words. The form of the creator of this world was naturally not in human form. His form, however, was extremely special. In the eyes of ordinary humanoid creatures, it was an extremely ugly form. However, this form had a unique charm. It did not give off a feeling of ugliness at all. Instead, it was extremely harmonious and perfect, and no one would feel the slightest bit of disgust towards it. Who are you? As expected, the creator of this world had discovered the heavenly will incarnation. He looked at the heavenly will incarnation with an extremely strong sense of wariness in his eyes as he asked. At this moment, when he was going through endless tribulations, a completely unfamiliar living being suddenly appeared. It was a living being that surpassed the limits of his imagination, so anyone would suspect its identity. The first target of suspicion was clearly a product of the tribulations. It was a completely new change that the tribulations had created for him. The creator of this world was no exception. At this moment, he only treated the heavenly will incarnation before him as a derivative of the tribulations, another change of the tribulations. At this moment, he unleashed his senses to the limit, using all of his means to observe all of the secrets of the heavenly will incarnation. He wanted to find the weakness of the heavenly will incarnation so that he could instantly erase it. The heavenly will incarnation did not mind this kind of sensing at all. After all, this was the world that the creator of this world had created. Here, the creator of this world naturally had unbelievable authority, so it was natural for him to use this kind of method to sense and investigate him. Thus, he said, "Don't worry, I'm not a derivative of the tribulations. I come from another world, a world that has great kindness towards you. I've come here this time to make a deal with you." At this moment, the creator of this world instantly understood that everything the heavenly will incarnation had said was true. At the very least, from what he currently saw, everything was true. All of the methods he used to investigate the heavenly will incarnation told him that it did not have the slightest aura that belonged to the tribulations. All of its structure, all of its details, and all of its profoundness were based on a different set of rules and a different worldview. At the very least, this was something that he had never sensed from the tribulations in the tens of millions of years that he had been through. This made the contents of the heavenly will incarnation's words more corroborate. There were many corroborations to the words of the heavenly will incarnation, so he could naturally treat them as true. Let's hear it. The creator of this world said to the heavenly will incarnation. Since what the heavenly will incarnation said was true, there was no problem in listening to what the heavenly will incarnation had to say. Although he did not feel that he had anything to trade with the heavenly will incarnation at this moment. "Since you're willing to have an exchange, why don't you move the world first?" The heavenly will incarnation smiled. Hearing this, the creator of this world was puzzled. "Move the world? I've never heard of the world being moved." At this moment, he was very curious. He wanted to understand what the heavenly will incarnation meant, and how the heavenly will incarnation could achieve the so-called goal of moving the world. "It's rather troublesome to explain. I just need you to slightly change the tremors of the world," the heavenly will incarnation said plainly. As he spoke, he slightly released a subtle fluctuation. It was a fluctuation that belonged to the transportation network layer. As long as the fluctuation of the world was changed to this fluctuation, it would be able to resonate with the transportation network layer. Once that happened, the creator of this world would be able to sense the existence of the transportation network layer. At the same time, he would also be able to establish an inconceivable understanding of the transportation network layer around him. Once this understanding was established, then this world would naturally be directly connected to the transportation network layer. This seemed to be not much different from the heavenly will incarnation. Of course, this method was also created because Luo Fan's understanding of the heavenly will incarnation layer was getting deeper and deeper. The heavenly will incarnation layer was also a layer that simulated the state of chaos. The transportation network layer was also a layer that simulated the state of chaos. Both of them simulated the state of chaos, so they naturally had some commonalities that could not be erased. This commonality that could not be erased made the two of them a reference. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan continuously researched the heavenly will incarnation layer over the years. As he researched the various mysteries and secrets of the heavenly will incarnation layer, he naturally deepened his understanding of the transportation network layer. His requirements for connecting the world to the transportation network layer were naturally lowered. Thus, he was able to use such a simple method to connect the world to the transportation network layer. He did not need to forcefully change the entire world, or even change the worldview of the creator of this world in order to connect it. The creator of this world pondered carefully and realized that this change did not affect him much. At the very least, it was not an effect that he could discover. Thus, he nodded and said, "It's just changing the fluctuation? It's very simple." At that moment, his heart moved slightly. The ripples and vibrations in this part of the world started to change slightly. As it changed, he faintly sensed an incomparably huge network. In that network, there was the subtle aura of the existence in front of him. It was as if the existence in front of him had expanded itself into an incomparably huge network. It was also as if the existence in front of him was only a small part of that huge network. "I see. I didn't expect there to be so many worlds outside of the world." At this moment, the creator of this world felt a strong sense of shock. To the creator of this world, he could not recognize that there were many worlds in the simulated state of chaos. Perhaps he knew that there were other worlds in the simulated state of chaos, but he could only rely on his own guesses, his own understanding of the world, and his understanding of the simulated state of chaos. He had never seen and sensed those heavens and earth with such clarity before. At this moment, the moment he adjusted the fluctuations of the world around him, he discovered that the countless worlds that he had only guessed had actually appeared in front of him. There were no longer any illusions. How could he not be greatly shocked by this? At this moment, because he had diverted his attention to adjust the tremors of the world, the tribulations in this world had slightly broken through his defenses and invaded his body, causing the surface of his body to rumble. Only after a while did he calm down and return to his original state. "Now that I've moved the world, what's the deal?" the creator of this world said. As he spoke, he did not look at the creator of this world. Instead, he looked beyond this world, at the transportation network that had unknowingly taken in this world. Or rather, at the very center, above the world of laws. From the core world of laws, he could sense an aura that was tens of thousands of times stronger than the aura of the incarnation of the heavens way before him. One could imagine that the world in front of him was the main body of the incarnation of the heavens way. At the very least, it was the world that belonged to the incarnation of the heavens way. No matter how pathetic the creator of this world was and how he had chosen the wrong method to resist the tribulations, he was still the creator of this world. As the creator of this world, his understanding of the world, his understanding of the world, and his understanding of the chaotic state were naturally extremely deep. Although the incarnation of the heavens way had appeared before him, he could instantly tell that it was just a clone, or rather, a port that was facing him. What truly wanted to contact him and make a deal with him was not this port, but the world behind this port, the ruler of the world, the creator of this world. Therefore, he did not look at the incarnation of the heavens way before him. Instead, he looked at the main body behind it, which was the center of the transportation network, above the world of laws. Facing this situation, the incarnation of the heavens way only smiled faintly. "Since you've come here, I believe you should understand that I have the ability to help you survive this tribulation. I admit it. Your strength is indeed at this level. You can help me survive this tribulation and allow my world to escape and not be destroyed in the tribulation," the creator of this world said faintly. Chapter 27:39. Then, what's the deal? The creator changed the topic. It was naturally impossible for Luo Fan to answer the words of the creator of this world. The creator was naturally the Heavenly Ways clone. Hearing the creator's words, the Heavenly Ways clone smiled and told him about the deals he had made with the tens of millions of creators in the transportation network layer. Separate an avatar that doesn't have any special characteristics and enter that world? The creator murmured as if he was deep in thought. It was just a transaction condition, but it had already made the creator of this world feel that Luo Fan's perspective was completely different from his own. To him, the world was the most important. Apart from the world, everything else was just an accessory to the world. They could be abandoned and created at any time. However, it was clear that to the master of the Heavenly Ways clone, the world seemed to be insignificant. Only the concepts, cognition, and various subtle principles attached to the world were the most important. This difference in perspective made Luo Fan become unfathomable in his eyes. Of course, although he felt that Luo Fan had become unfathomable, it didn't mean that he had to distort his perspective and view everything he had with Luo Fan's superior perspective. After all, the reason why a concept was a concept was that it had completely fused with one's fundamental cognition. Distorting this concept was equivalent to distorting oneself. If one wasn't truly sure that this concept was correct, that this concept could allow one to climb higher, and that one truly agreed with this concept, no one would easily distort it. This was especially so for the creator, who hadn't experienced Luo Fan's baptism. Since Luo Fan only wanted an avatar that didn't have any special characteristics and didn't need anything else, the creator, who had been forced to his limits by the tribulations, naturally couldn't refuse. He immediately agreed to the deal and separated an avatar for the Heavenly Ways clone. The Heavenly Ways clone smiled and took the avatar, sending it into the world of laws. Because of this action, another stream of light, which had disappeared for many years, appeared in the transportation network layer. After sending the incarnation into the world of laws, the incarnation of the Heavenly Tao didn't hesitate and directly took over the authority to control this world according to the deal. With his own knowledge and understanding of tribulations, he directly changed the subtle structure of this world and began to rapidly eliminate the terrifying consequences caused by the power of the tribulations in this world. Following this change, the creator of this world quickly felt the pressure he had to endure rapidly weaken. In just a few years, his body had completely broken free from the amber formed by the power of the tribulations, and he'd regained the freedom that he'd lost for countless millions of years since he'd encountered the tribulations. The moment he regained his freedom, the creator of this world was extremely excited. Only those who have lost it will know how precious it is. Freedom is something that is insignificant when you have it, and you feel that countless things are more important than it. However, only when he had truly lost his freedom did he truly understand that there was nothing more important than freedom. After breaking free from the amber formed by the power of the tribulations, the creator of this world expressed his gratitude to the Heavenly Ways clone. After that, he didn't hesitate to separate an avatar from his world and send it into the transportation network layer to communicate with the other creators of the other worlds in the transportation network layer. As far as the creator of this world was concerned, he had existed in this simulated chaotic state for countless trillions of years. Communicating with others of the same kind was something that he didn't even dare to hope for in the past. But now, in the transportation network layer, there were tens of millions of people of the same kind that might not be able to be counted clearly. Under such circumstances, with so many of his kind in front of him, how could he resist the desire to communicate? Of course, although he couldn't resist the desire to communicate, it didn't mean that he had no scruples. At the very least, in his eyes, his world was still the most important, more important than everything else. Therefore, even though he had such a strong desire to communicate, he didn't let his real body leave his world. Instead, he just placed his will in his avatar to leave the world and head to another world. Communicating with other world creators might be an extremely precious opportunity for the new creator of this world, but it wasn't that precious to the creators of this world who had entered the transportation network layer long ago. Many years ago, they had already entered the transportation network layer for the first time. His wish to communicate with the other creators of the world had already been fulfilled long ago. For the current them, communicating with other world creators was something that couldn't be more normal. Under such circumstances, the new creator of this world merely attracted the attention of some of the more curious world creators. From this, one could infer the standard of the many world creators towards the new creator of this world. Evidently, they weren't very enthusiastic about him. They only treated the new creator of this world as the most ordinary of passers-by. Some of the more hospitable ones received the new creator of this world well, while some of the more reclusive ones couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the new creator of this world. The various different attitudes were novel to the new creator of this world. Not only was he not affected by it, but he also felt that it was extremely natural. In just a few years, he had completely integrated into the transportation network layer. He was special and different from everyone else. Everyone was extremely curious about him and paid great attention to him, which might be a good situation. However, if he really encountered such treatment, it would instead be a great obstacle for him to integrate into the group. Because you're special, others will notice that you're different. They'll notice that you don't fit in with the rest of them. If he wanted to get rid of this feeling of incompatibility, he would need to put in more effort. Judging from the current situation that the new creator of this world encountered, it was clear that all the other world creators only treated him as an ordinary world creator, an existence with the same essence as them. In other words, they treated him as an ordinary person. Under such circumstances, they naturally recognized the essence of the new creator of this world, and naturally recognized him as one of them. In that case, as long as he got rid of this sense of unfamiliarity, he would naturally be able to integrate into the group easily. After integrating into it, the past and present lives of the transportation network layer would naturally be displayed in front of the new creator of this world, allowing him to have a deeper understanding of Luo Fan. An indescribable sense of respect was thus established in his heart. He had no enmity with Luo Fan, nor did he suffer any losses because of Luo Fan's existence. On the contrary, his first interaction with Luo Fan had brought him a deal that gave him great benefits. Under such circumstances, he didn't need to consider the past conflicts between him and Luo Fan at all. He could look at everything from the most objective, and even lean towards Luo Fan's point of view and weigh everything in this way. The extremely profound wisdom and incredible means revealed by Luo Fan's actions naturally made him admire him. With this kind of admiration, he then devoted more of his will into the incarnation that entered the world of laws. Through this incarnation, he continued to deepen his understanding of the world of laws. Of course, the purpose of the incarnation of the other world creators was different. What he was looking for was not the meaning of the existence of the heavenly Tao, but the existence of Luo Fan. After all, he had never seen Luo Fan before, but he had heard countless legends about Luo Fan from the mouths of the other world creators. He had long been extremely curious about him. Now that he was in the world of laws, the incarnation was the best way to satisfy this curiosity. With such convenience, how could he give up on using this convenient condition to satisfy his curiosity? Luo Fan naturally wouldn't pay attention to the thoughts of the world creator. At this moment, after accepting the incarnation of the world creator into the world of laws, he felt some kind of inexplicable pressure suddenly appearing out of nowhere and faintly pressing down on his world of laws. This kind of pressure was so subtle, so obscure, but it really existed. With his grasp and perception of the world of laws, there was no way he would be wrong about it. If it's not from the tribulation level, then where did it come from? Why did it appear? At this moment, such a thought flashed in his mind, and he only felt an inexplicable fog covering his eyes. This pressure appeared because the incarnation of the world creator had entered his world of laws. In that case, this pressure must be related to the world creator. After thinking for a long time, this was the only thing he could be sure of. With this thought in mind, he turned his gaze to the world that had become the most ordinary node in the transportation network level and began to conduct a deeper exploration of that world. In essence, that world was no different from the other worlds in this world that numbered in the tens of millions. All of them existed in this simulated primal chaos state, and they were the worlds created by the creators of the world. However, the appearance of the other worlds didn't bring any pressure to him. Instead, it was like an extension of his limbs, allowing him to control the strength and power of the transportation network level to continuously increase. However, the integration of the world in front of him, which was essentially no different from the other worlds, brought him this kind of obscure pressure. This situation was strange no matter how he looked at it. Where did it come from? He thought to himself as he went deeper into that world layer by layer, observing the various situations in that world. If it wasn't for the help of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao in that world, it wouldn't have been so easy for Luo Fan to achieve this. At the very least, it would have been noticed by the world creator. But now, with the existence of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao, the situation was completely different. This was because the incarnation of the heavenly Tao had already completely grasped all the authority of that world. Therefore, it could easily bypass the world creator and guide Luo Fan's perception into the depths of that world, easily bypassing the world creator to thoroughly investigate that world. With the help of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao, his investigation was naturally extremely smooth. In just a short period of time, he had already completed the entire task and clearly investigated the inside and outside of this world. After a thorough investigation, he was even more astonished. This was because he discovered that the situation in this world was indeed no different from the other worlds. It was also very ordinary. It was a world created by the world creator, and it was difficult for it to even resist the first great calamity of the world. It was normal for such a world to flow into the transportation network level like flowing water. It was inconceivable for it to give him this kind of obscure and indistinct pressure. Looks like there's only one possibility. After a long time, Luo Fan let out a long breath, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. It wasn't this world that directly gave him this kind of pressure, so there was obviously only one possibility. It was some kind of existence that was connected to this world that gave him this kind of pressure. And what was the existence that was connected to this world? Of course, it was the other worlds. This also proved Luo Fan's previous guess about the structure of the many worlds that were simulated in the state of chaos. In his original guess, the structure of the world that was simulated in the state of chaos should be in the shape of a pyramid. In other words, the more worlds that passed the great calamity, the higher the level of the pyramid. The worlds at the top of the pyramid had an extremely close connection with the worlds at the bottom of the pyramid, or rather, it had an extremely subtle influence. This connection and influence affected all aspects of the world, and even affected the concept of the world creator. In the end, it subtly made the world creator agree with the concept of a higher level, and in the end, it became some kind of foundation, some kind of fulcrum for the highest level. Chapter 2740. It wasn't the world itself, nor was it the structure of the world itself, nor was it the creator of the world. In that case, after thinking about it, there was only one possibility. The pressure that made him feel was from the existence behind the world. As early as when he thought of the pyramid-like structure in the simulated state of chaos, he had already guessed that there must be a world that had survived more great tribulation of heaven and earth behind it, influencing this world. In other words, this lower world belonged to the sphere of influence of the world that had survived more great tribulation of heaven and earth, or in other words, was in its territory. Even Luo Fan's own world of laws was the same. In fact, he had been thoroughly investigating, comprehending, and sensing in his own world of laws all these years in order to find traces of his world of laws being influenced by other worlds. As for the gains that he had made up for the many gaps in his world of laws, they were just accidental gains. If things were really as he had guessed, that behind every world, there was a world that had gone through even more great tribulations of the world, influencing that world and controlling that world from a certain level, then everything that was happening right now could be understood. Now, Luo Fan had included that world into the transportation network layer. Although this wasn't directly moving a world and changing its location, in this simulated state of chaos, this behavior was equivalent to bringing this world into one's control. What kind of behavior would this be for the world that had survived more great tribulation of heaven and earth, which had originally influenced this world? What would such a situation be like for the world that had already gone through multiple great tribulations of heaven and earth that affected this part of the world? It was clearly an act of snatching food from a tiger's mouth, an act of snatching away the resources in its own territory. Under such circumstances, what kind of reaction would the world behind that world have? It would definitely be hostile to Luo Fan's world of laws, and might even take some action against it. And at this time, the pressure that Luo Fan felt on his world of laws was very likely coming from that world, and it was the world that had survived at least 2 great tribulations of heaven and earth. After figuring this out, Luo Fan felt that the world in his eyes had undergone a subtle change. Many things that were originally blurry suddenly became clear. The pressure that he couldn't find any traces of before and couldn't figure out what was going on also revealed traces at this moment. So it's from here. At this moment, Luo Fan's gaze shifted to a certain place in the sky. He could vaguely feel that there was some invisible pressure being transmitted from that world to his world of laws through the endless simulation of chaos, directly affecting all aspects of his world of laws, including the heavenly Tao, the great Tao, the nomological laws, and even time, space, matter, and energy. It was to the extent that even the numerous parallel existences were included and targeted. Although these attacks weren't very effective, they were able to ignore almost all obstacles and defenses, directly bypassing everything to affect the target's existence. At this moment, when it was distributed to the countless existences, it was naturally hard to detect. However, if they were to converge into a single point, then even the creator of the world would have to be careful in order to withstand it. What a wonderful pressure! At this moment, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. After searching for so long, he finally found a trace that he could truly feel. Although this trace was targeted at him, a trace was still a trace. Grasping this trace was equivalent to grasping a rare breakthrough point. With such a breakthrough point, it would only be a matter of time if he wanted to find more and finally figure out everything he wanted to understand. Under such circumstances, how could he not feel happy? How could he not feel excited? However, the pressure at this time was still too small, and the trace was still too obscure. It wasn't impossible to use such a small pressure and trace as a breakthrough point, but he might need to put in thousands of times more effort to achieve the desired effect. Therefore, at this time, Luo Fan didn't take action directly, and began to carefully comprehend the subtle mystery behind this pressure. Instead, he let the heavenly Tao incarnation split into thousands of incarnations, and then sent these incarnations into the tribulation level through the passage between the world of laws and the tribulation level. Then, through the subtle gaps formed by the connection between the many worlds in the tribulation level, he sent them to thousands of worlds. This time, his luck wasn't as good as the previous time. In other words, the luck of the heavenly Tao incarnations wasn't as good as the previous time. In the end, among the thousands of heavenly Tao incarnations, only a small half of them could find the path to the target, cross the tribulation level, and directly enter the target world. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan didn't feel that it was a pity. After those heavenly Tao incarnations were wiped out by the power of the tribulation level, he directly sent more incarnations into the tribulation level, and let these new incarnations replace the positions of the lost incarnations. They were just heading towards the target. This happened again, and in the end, the world that consumed the most incarnations used up a total of 8 heavenly Tao incarnations to contact the target. However, the target he chose this time was not the same as the previous time. He only chose the target that was most likely to agree to his deal. Instead, he chose a world that was clearly in a different region and was in a different territory of a world that had gone through the second great tribulation of heaven and earth. He wanted to sense more of that kind of pressure and study it better. Naturally, he needed as much pressure as possible, and he also needed as much as possible to have as much rich pressure as possible. If he only wholeheartedly chose the territory of a certain world and wholeheartedly chose that world to trap, then the pressure he received in the end would naturally only be the pressure of that world. Perhaps the only difference from the beginning was that the pressure had increased a lot. This situation was obviously what Luo Fan didn't want to see. No matter how much the pressure increased, it was still a kind of pressure. As a kind of pressure, no matter how much it increased, it was only a kind of pressure. It was just an example, and it was impossible to summarize the overall, universal laws from it. Naturally, it was even more difficult to figure out the profound meaning behind this pressure. In order to enrich his sample as much as possible, enrich the types of pressure he could encounter as much as possible, and capture as many aspects of the profound meaning as possible, he had chosen the world by casting a wide net. The result of such a wide net was that not every incarnation of the Heaven's Way that he sent into the various worlds was successful. After all, some of the worlds that the incarnations of the Heaven's Way chose had not reached the end of the line. They still had hope that they could survive the great tribulation of heaven and earth and obtain the benefits of the great tribulation. Such worlds naturally wouldn't so easily call out the ruling authority of their own world, and it was even more impossible for them to easily agree to the conditions of a complete stranger that they didn't understand at all. The number of such worlds exceeded 20%. In other words, in the end, only 80% of the incarnations of the Heaven's Way that reached those worlds achieved the goal that Luo Fan wanted, which was to make those world founders agree to trade with him and connect their worlds to the transportation network. Luo Fan was naturally a little disappointed by this situation, but he wasn't too disappointed. Although not all the worlds agreed to the trade. But with 80% of the worlds agreeing, this was already enough in terms of quantity. As more and more worlds began to change the way they vibrated, they gradually began to resonate with the transportation network, which began to gradually strengthen. More and more empty areas were formed, and more roads were formed, connecting the worlds that appeared out of thin air in the empty areas and gradually connecting them to the transportation network. For Luo Fan, the connection of these worlds strengthened his power. It meant that he could obtain more pressure from the other worlds and better understand the profoundness behind the pressure released by those worlds. It was a change that was half happy and half worried. But for these worlds, this change brought them almost all benefit. Changing the way their own worlds vibrated and fluctuated was, in the eyes of a higher level, a change that would affect one's own foundation. Even the target of one's attachment had been changed. This was naturally a huge impact, and it was difficult to determine whether it was good or bad. However, that was only in the eyes of the higher-ups. In the eyes of the heavens and earths at their current level, this change would only bring them benefits. First of all, he already had the incarnation of the Heaven's Way to help him through his tribulation. Now, the most urgent danger, which was the danger of death, no longer existed. Secondly, after he connected to the transportation network layer, it was equivalent to directly entering a large group. From then on, the feeling of loneliness in the pitch-black void had mostly disappeared. From today onwards, he would be able to find people who shared the same Tao as him and communicate with the founders of other worlds at will. Thirdly, he would be able to truly see a higher level of existence, see what a higher level world looked like, and truly obtain a direction to go further. With all these benefits, how could the creators of those worlds care about the incarnation they had sacrificed? Even if they heard from the other creators of the transportation network that their incarnations would suffer for countless years after entering, it was not enough to change their rejoicing. Without truly experiencing it, without truly experiencing the torment of time, without truly experiencing the feeling of everything being explored and everything no longer being fresh, they could not imagine how unbearable that feeling was. However, even if it was unbearable, even if they had to abandon their incarnations in the end, they felt that it was worth it. After all, it didn't seem to be a big deal to sacrifice an incarnation after obtaining so many benefits, right? Luo Fan could imagine the thoughts of those creators, but he didn't pay much attention to them. At this moment, as more and more worlds entered the transportation network layer and truly became a part of it, he could already feel invisible threads being produced from the sky and constantly acting on his world of laws, making his world of laws seem to be gradually shrouded in some kind of indescribable fog. This fog obscured everything in his world of laws. It was so turbid that it seemed to be trying to completely obscure his perception of everything in the world. Faced with such a situation, a solemn expression appeared on his face. This fog was formed from the pressure of the many worlds of laws on his world of laws. At this moment, he was extremely glad that he had chosen so many different territories to include in his transportation network layer. It was precisely because of the different pressures produced by so many worlds that he could truly see the essence of these pressures. This kind of pressure was actually not real pressure, or rather, the source wasn't pressure but change. The reason why it appeared to be pressure was because the previous change was only a kind, and it was also resisted by the world of laws itself. It was because of the interaction between this resistance and the change itself that it appeared to be pressure. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan only chose one side of the world to trap and only endured the effect of one side of the world, then he would always believe that it was pressure. In the end, the exploration of this kind of pressure, or rather, the exploration of that effect, would only proceed in the direction of pressure. In this case, perhaps he would indeed be able to gain some benefits at the beginning, feel that he had made some progress, and recognize some things that he couldn't recognize before. But that was only the beginning. When he continued to study it in depth and wanted to deduce and expand it, he would find that he would run into walls everywhere, and in the end, he might even be at a loss for what to do and completely cut off all hope of progress at a certain stage. Such a situation was obviously unbearable for him. As for why this was the case, the reason was very simple. It was because the pressure was the result of the combination of the world of laws and the world of laws. This combination was so close that it could be said to be an inseparable combination. Under such circumstances, continuing to study it would only be equivalent to constantly studying the interaction between the two. In the end, he would only be able to truly study the interaction between the two. Compared to what Luo Fan really wanted to study, there was a world of difference between it and the profound meaning behind it. R.W. Chapter 2741. But now, everything that happened to the world of laws completely avoided this drawback. That was because the pressure acting on the world of laws at this time was no longer just from one side of the world. The pressure from the many worlds on the world of laws was also the result of the interaction between the world of laws and those worlds. Or rather, it was the result of many changes in the direction of the world of laws. If this change was only in one direction, then it would naturally be like a force that oppressed the world of laws in a certain direction. However, the many changes affected and interfered with each other. In the end, the oppression in a certain direction naturally offset a part of each other, revealing the nature of the changes. It was precisely because of this that the combined effect of the many worlds at this time appeared like this fog. Feeling the fog, Luo Fan felt a strong lingering fear in his heart. If he hadn't cast a wide net, he might have been running wildly on the wrong path now. However, at this time, this situation was naturally completely avoided. At this moment, his heart stirred slightly, and he began to carefully experience the fog, comprehending the various effects it had on his world of laws. At this time, the many world founders had also gradually completed the transaction with the heavenly Tao incarnation of the world of laws. Or rather, they had completed the transaction with Luofan, sending their incarnations into the world of laws one after another. After entering this place, the incarnations of the world founders all felt inexplicably surprised. That was because compared to the original incarnations of the world founders, they had a new feeling. It was a familiar feeling. The familiar feeling wasn't because their main bodies had come into contact with the heavenly Tao incarnations, but it was a feeling that they had felt in their own world. It was a feeling that had been deeply engraved in their instincts for countless trillions of years. What's going on? Why does this world feel like it belongs to me? It can't be that this is the feeling of the foundation of all the worlds, right? The world founders were all bewildered. If it was an ordinary cultivator or creature, they might have regarded this feeling as the feeling of the foundation of the world. However, no matter what, they were still world founders. They were powerful existences that could find a foothold in this simulated state of chaos and open up a world in it. How could his spiritual sense be concealed by this kind of appearance? After a round of investigation, they instantly confirmed that this was not the feeling of the heaven and earth, but a feeling that should not exist, a feeling brought about by an extremely deep influence. How could this be? The clones of the world founders were even more shocked. This shock caused them to return to their original bodies one by one. This caused their true bodies to be on guard as well. At this moment, those true bodies began to carefully examine their own world, probing the feeling that their own world gave them. However, after this exploration, they suddenly discovered that their world, which had existed for an unknown number of trillions of years and had long turned into their instincts, had completely disappeared. What replaced it seemed to be a brand new feeling, a subtle feeling brought about by the transportation network layer. What's going on? Those world pioneers instantly lost the excitement of stepping into the transportation network layer. At this instant, they suddenly faintly felt that they were like flying insects that had fallen into a spider's web. It seemed like no matter how they struggled, they were unable to struggle free of the spider's web, and no matter how they struggled, they were unable to obtain true freedom. This kind of feeling was abhorrent to all living beings. It was even more so for the world founders. At this time, how could these world founders still have the mood to pay attention to other things? As for the clones that were originally sent out to communicate with the other world founders, they also retracted them one by one. They only focused their minds on their true bodies and the clones that had entered the world of laws. With the help of the different senses between the two, they sensed the sudden influence and the nature of the influence that had suddenly disappeared. The time it took for these world creators to discover this was different. However, in the end, even the slowest world creator would only discover this anomaly a few days after their world was connected to the transportation network, or rather, a few days after they sent their incarnations into the world of laws. After that, they naturally chose to retract their clones that were communicating with the other world founders and focused their minds on their true bodies and the place where their true bodies were. The reason why they could discover this anomaly so quickly and uniformly was because of a simple reason. It was precisely because they had already turned the influence of the upper world into an instinctive feeling. Under such circumstances, after entering the parallel space of the world of laws, he could instantly feel the influence of the upper world of laws on the world of laws from the world of laws. Once he felt this influence, everything that happened after that would naturally develop. As for the first world founder to step into the transportation network layer, because when his clone entered the parallel space of the world of laws, the influence of the upper world on the world of laws was still extremely weak, or rather, it was also because it was only the influence of one side of the world. When it interacted with Luofan's world of laws, it changed to a certain extent and became different from before. Because it had become different, It naturally couldn't give him the same feeling as when his world was still in its original position, which had already been engraved into his instincts. And without this feeling, he naturally couldn't discover this anomaly, but that was obviously only temporary. At this time, more and more worlds connected to the transportation network layer, and more world founders comprehended this anomaly, but he also gradually discovered the existence of this anomaly, and gradually gained enlightenment. What exactly has been affecting me all this time? At this moment, an indescribable hostility arose in the heart of the world founder. This hostility directly manifested from his own world, causing his world to undergo a subtle reversal at this moment. It made the world that had originally calmed down and seemed to have completely escaped from the calamity once again sink a little in the direction of the calamity. Of course, this influence was quickly eliminated by the incarnation of the heaven's will. This world wouldn't completely fall into an uncontrollable situation because of this hostility. They actually discovered it. At this moment, Luo Fan also discovered the situation of these world founders, and couldn't help but feel a little surprised. However, the clones of the world founders were all in his world of laws after all. Hence, he quickly figured out how the world founders had discovered this through their clones. For a moment, his emotions became a little complicated. However, in the end, he still turned this complicated emotion into one of joy. For him, it wasn't his goal to incorporate these worlds into his own territory and influence them so that they could change and adjust according to his worldview. At least, compared to this goal, he had a more important goal. After all, the entire simulated chaos state was born because of him. It was because he was undergoing the seventh Great Tribulation that the Great Tribulation would give rise to such a simulated chaos state, as well as such an endless world and such a complicated pyramid structure. Because of this background, no matter how much territory he occupied in this simulated state of chaos, what was the use of spreading his influence into more worlds? Ultimately, his goal was to transcend this simulated chaos state and even destroy this simulated chaos state. How much help would it be to spread the influence of his worldview into many worlds to achieve this goal? In contrast, it might be more beneficial for more and more world founders to realize the structure of this pyramid and realize that their world had always been under the influence and control of some upper world. After all, given the nature of the founders of the world, most of them would be enraged when they realized that their world had always been under the control of a hidden hand. They would want to break free from that shackle and obtain freedom. And this kind of thinking would obviously lead to some kind of chaos. No one knew just how great of an impact this chaos would have on the structure of the pyramid. However, this chaos would definitely give him more opportunities. It would definitely allow him to comprehend more of the mysteries of this pyramid structure and even discover the weakness of this pyramid structure. And all of this was obviously of great benefit to him. Therefore, at this time, not only did he not suppress the world founders, but he also gave them a lot of convenience, allowing the heavenly Tao incarnations in the world of laws to create all kinds of special opportunities for the world founders' incarnations, allowing them to more clearly feel the influence of the countless worlds on the world of laws. Or rather, to feel the new layer of fog that had appeared. The mist wasn't something that could be sensed by the creators of the world, let alone their clones. Normally, even if Luo Fan spread this fog in front of them, they wouldn't be able to discover it at all. But what could they do? In this world of laws, Luo Fan was an almost omnipotent existence. To him, everything in this world of laws was under his absolute control, so it couldn't be any easier for him to instill some concepts and knowledge into the incarnations of the world founders. He didn't need to forcibly instill these concepts into the minds of the incarnations of the world founders. He only needed to distort the various living beings and substances that the incarnations of the world founders came into contact with, and pass this knowledge to the incarnations of the world founders bit by bit. After all, this parallel world of laws was a completely unfamiliar place to the world founders. Everything that appeared here was an existence that the incarnations of the world founders had never seen before. Under such circumstances, their cognition was in an extremely active state. At this time, instilling this knowledge and concept that they originally didn't have would naturally make them regard it as some kind of characteristic of this world of laws. Accepting it was naturally countless times easier than forcibly reversing their cognition. This kind of thing was actually quite simple, and Luo Fan didn't even need to handle it personally. He only needed to instruct the heavenly Tao incarnation to complete all of this easily. In the end, in just a few breaths of time outside, and only a few years had passed in the many parallel worlds of laws, Luo Fan had already instilled the concepts and knowledge he wanted into the hearts of the incarnations of the world founders. As these knowledge and concepts were instilled into their minds, the fog that they originally couldn't perceive naturally appeared in their senses. And they soon discovered the influence of the other worlds on their own world from the fog. It's actually such an existence. It actually has such an influence. Damn it. The incarnations of the world founders continuously transmitted what they sensed back to their original bodies, causing the world founders to be inexplicably furious. The worlds of the world founders also began to show all kinds of fluctuations. Of course, all of this was nothing to the existence of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao. For countless years I've actually been under the influence of that world. Why? Why is it like this? How many of the decisions I made before were of my own will, and how many of them were made because of the influence of that world? This thought appeared in the hearts of the many world founders. In fact, how much of my current thoughts are my own? This thought also appeared in the hearts of the world founders. Chapter 2742. The world founders felt their hair stand on end. These pioneers of the world did not consider Luo Fan to be on their side at all. To them, everything they discovered in the world of laws was their own discoveries. All the concepts and knowledge they obtained were obtained through their own learning, and they were closer to the correct understanding. Under such circumstances, they did not think that these cognition were generated by Luo Fan, and these concepts were given by Luo Fan. With such a mentality, for them, Luo Fan was no different from the other heaven and earth creators who had previously controlled their heaven and earth and influenced their hearts. Now, their world had obviously been connected to the transportation network layer, and this transportation network layer was completely under the control of Luo Fan's world of laws. In this way, they could obviously infer that their world might also be under the influence of Luo Fan's world of laws. His own thoughts, his own concepts, his own knowledge, his own intelligence, all of them could have been affected by it and become like this. With such a thought in mind, how could they not feel their hair stand on end? However, although they were aware of this possibility, it was obviously not that simple to find traces of this influence and the various existences that might have appeared in their bodies due to the influence of Luo Fan's world of laws. Although Luo Fan had clearly realized that his world of laws might be influenced by other worlds, it was obvious that he had not gained much after such a long time. At this time, no matter how these world founders experienced, comprehended, and thoroughly investigated themselves, they could only find that they had completely gotten rid of all influences, broken all shackles, and completely regained their freedom. That was something that caused the creators of the world to feel even more fearful. Obviously, this kind of influence wouldn't disappear so easily. They had been affected when they were in another territory before, but there was no reason that they wouldn't be affected in this new territory. Under such circumstances, they actually could not perceive the existence of this influence at all, and could not find the abnormality that should have existed. This represented a fact. That kind of influence, that kind of abnormality, had surpassed the limits of what he could feel, and this meant that the possibility of him breaking free from this influence was even slimmer. How could they not feel fearful and speechless? Just what kind of influence is it? This was the question that arose in the hearts of the newly joined pioneers. The more they thought about it, the more terrified they became, the more wary they became, and the more uneasy they showed. Their performance, however, left the world pioneers who were already at the transportation network level astonished. These world founders were not simple existences. They would also put themselves in someone else's shoes. They naturally had their guesses as to what the new pioneers might do after entering the transportation network layer. In the beginning, the behavior of these new pioneers was just as they had guessed. But now, for some reason, the pioneers of the world had completely changed their style. They no longer visited their friends or traveled around. Instead, they locked themselves in their own world, as if they were autistic and no longer cared about anything happening in the outside world. It did not seem like they had entered a new, bustling place that they had never seen before. Instead, it was like they had entered a dragon's lair and a tiger's lair. Faced with such a situation, how could the world founders not be astonished? Because of this astonishment, they could not help but become curious about these new pioneers. Originally, they did not care about these new pioneers. Even if they came looking for them, they would at most see if they were easy to befriend, and then choose some pioneers with similar personalities to interact with. They did not really treat these new pioneers as special existences. But now, after the new pioneers closed their doors and no longer came into contact with them, they began to have the idea of understanding them. Once the world founders had an idea, they would naturally carry it out. Very soon, many of the founders of the new worlds began to head towards the new worlds and pay their respects to the founders of the new world. The new pioneers had extremely complicated feelings towards the visits of the pioneers. They did not hold much animosity towards these new world pioneers, only a sense of pity and sympathy for the loss of their own kind. After all, to them, the old world founders were under the control and influence of other worlds, yet they were unaware of it. Compared to the pioneers who could comprehend the existence of the influence, such existences were even more pitiful. However, this was only the difference between 50 and 100 step. They could not discover the existence of the traces, and they could not deal with the traces and influence. In comparison, there was not much difference whether they were aware of it or not. However, they also knew that there was no evidence, and even if they said it, not many pioneers would believe them. Hence, most of them could only casually find an excuse to brush off the queries of the pioneers. Only a small number of creators of the world would speak of what they thought, sensed, and understood. Evidently, what they said did not receive the approval of any of the pioneers. The pioneers merely said that it was an illusion caused by the unfamiliarity of entering the transportation network layer, and they did not take it to heart. This was to be expected. They did not sense any abnormalities at all, and even felt that the transportation network layer was so pleasant and wonderful. Now, someone suddenly told them that this was not heaven, but hell. One would be corroded by poisons at all times, and if one did not take any measures, one would soon lose his life. Who would believe such a thing? Faced with the distrust of the pioneers who spoke the truth could only sigh inwardly. At that moment, they could only ask the pioneers to leave, while they continued to ponder and explore. Those who walked different paths could not make plans together. That was all. Faced with such a situation, the previous world pioneers were naturally displeased. However, there were gradually fewer and fewer pioneers who came to visit the newcomers. They also did not have any favorable impressions of the pioneers who answered their questions perfunctorily. After all, if it was really because of all sorts of messy reasons, how could all the new pioneers make the same choice, choosing to close their doors at the same time, and no longer roaming around? If they made the same choice so uniformly, then they must have the same reason and consideration, which was why they made the same choice. However, they had no intention of revealing this reason and consideration at all, and actually used those perfunctory answers to brush them off. Under such circumstances, how could the old pioneers have any favorable impressions of the newcomers? How could they not bear grudges? Of course, during this process, the words of the pioneers who had already expressed their thoughts were also gradually leaked, and were gradually known by many of the old pioneers. Naturally, the majority of the old pioneers did not believe in such words, and thought that it was merely a misconception of the newcomers who could not adapt to the environment. Naturally, there would be some pioneers who felt that it was not impossible, and began to use all sorts of methods to probe and investigate. However, in the end, the results of their probing and investigations made them certain that it was really just a misconception. That was because no matter what methods they used, they could not discover the existence of the influence, nor could they discover the existence of the so-called control. If a creator of the universe had discovered this, they might have felt that they had overlooked something. However, if 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million, and 10 million founders of the world all came to the same conclusion and made the same discovery, then it was easy to imagine what the founders of the world would be like. As a result, a barrier began to form between the New World creators and the Old World creators. What a pity! They're clearly in hell, but they feel as if they're in heaven. One of the pioneers sighed inwardly as he looked at the other pioneers who were vaguely rejecting him. To them, although they were in pain and felt frustrated, as if they wanted to destroy everything, there was also a source of comfort for them. At the very least, they knew that there was a problem with where they were, and that there was a problem with their world. Even if they couldn't find the root of the problem, knowing was knowing. It was the same as knowing when one would die and not knowing when one would die. Those who knew when they were going to die would have a different mentality compared to those who didn't know when they were going to die. At this time, the difference between the new and old pioneers was like the difference between those who knew when they would die and those who didn't know when they would die. Looks like their target is still in that world. After failing to find their target in their world, the pioneers could only turn their target to the world of laws, to the place where their clones were. However, there was an incredible difference in the flow of time between their clones and their main bodies in the world of laws. While their main bodies had spent a few days here, their clones had spent billions of years in the world of laws. Over the course of hundreds of millions of years, their clones had already made great gains. At the very least, they could obtain a decisive position in the parallel world of laws. Their every action couldn't affect the entire history of the parallel world, but they could at least have a considerable impact, and it couldn't be easily ignored. As their status rose, the secrets that these clones knew also began to increase. Moreover, because of the convenience that Luo Fan had given them, they also had a deep understanding of the influence of other worlds on this world of laws. In other words, they already had a deep understanding of the fog that filled all parallel worlds after their cognition changed. This influence is actually distorting the world. No matter what it is, what factor, what rules, and what laws, they are all fundamentally distorted. Through this research, the clones of the world pioneers gradually discovered this essence. Of course, although this discovery was rare enough, it still didn't have much effect on their current situation and what they wanted to know. At the very least, for them, this wasn't enough to change the reality that their world was being affected and was under some kind of control. And after so many years of exploration and research, the clones of the world pioneers had actually gradually realized that the master of this world, the master of the heavenly Tao, was providing them with a lot of convenience. Or rather, he seemed to have made them put their clones into this world of laws for the sake of letting them explore this world. When these world pioneers completely focused their attention on these clones, they quickly discovered this and felt a sense of disbelief emerge from the bottom of their hearts. What is he thinking? Could it be that he made us put our clones into this world to nurture our opponents? Could there really be such a senseless person? This thought appeared in their minds. Of course, it couldn't be at the same time, but one after another in the past, they had more or less done this. They would nurture a creature that harbored evil intentions towards them, allowing the creature to grow to a certain height. Then, when the creature had grown to a certain level, it would come to fight with them, bringing them some entertainment. However, that was only when they had absolute confidence and the level of that world was countless times lower than theirs. That was only an action they would take. Would the master of the heavenly axioms incarnation really do that when faced with the world's founders? Please wait a moment. After the content is updated, you need to refresh the page to get the latest updates. NT. Chapter 2743. From the looks of it, our joining is obviously beneficial to him. But what kind of benefit is that? As long as those world founders thought about it for a while, they would naturally understand what the greatest possibility was. If they were the world founders of that world and the rulers of this transportation network layer, then there was obviously only one possibility for them to do such a thing, and that was for their own benefits. With this thought in mind, they began to pay more attention to the various subtle details displayed in that world of laws. Through these details, they wanted to deduce Luo Fan's purpose and understand Luo Fan's purpose. If they could find the root of all this and even think of a way to counter it, that would be for the best. Even if they couldn't find it, they had to at least get rid of their confusion. As they paid more attention to everything in the realm of laws, they became even less concerned about the barriers that had appeared in the transportation network outside the realm of laws. In this simulated chaos state, the barrier was not like in the normal world. Or rather, it was like in most normal worlds, where it was just an invisible barrier. In this place, because everything was based on cognition and ideas, this kind of estrangement naturally manifested itself in this place. In other words, as the estrangement deepened, there were fewer and fewer paths of communication between the new realms and the old realms. In the end, although it wasn't completely cut off, there were only a few small, faintly discernible paths that connected the jade pool together. In this way, the entire transportation network layer had unknowingly been divided into two parts. One of them was the vast network formed by the old world. The other part was the small transportation network formed by the new heaven and earth, which was many times less in number than the old heaven and earth. In this way, it seemed that the entire transportation network layer was divided into two independent islands, and the tiny, faintly discernible roads that existed between the two were like sailing routes on the ocean. However, all of this didn't matter to any of the world founders in the transportation network layer. It was the same for the old pioneers of the world, and it was the same for the new pioneers of the world. It was even more so for Luo Fan. After all, for Luo Fan, all he needed now was for the clones of the world founders to enter the world of laws and help him explore his own world. As for the real bodies of the world founders and their own worlds, all of that was secondary to him. At this moment, Luo Fan focused all his attention on his world of laws, or to be more specific, on the layer of fog. This layer of fog was extremely complicated and mysterious. Even in the world of laws, even if Luo Fan had complete and even absolute control over the world of laws, he was still confused about this fog. However, he was still confused by this fog. Although he knew that it was a change in nature, he was completely unaware of the reason behind this change. For this, Luo Fan had already expected it, but at this time, he did not feel discouraged or anything like that. If it was that easy to find the answer, then he wouldn't have wasted so much time and only made a slight breakthrough now. At this moment, Luo Fan had also sent his heavenly Tao clone to the various heavens and earth to communicate with the creators of the heavens and earth, expressing his intention to trade with them. Among them, some failed and some succeeded. In this way, the number of new worlds that joined the transportation network layer naturally continued to increase. The new world founders naturally didn't have any bias in the beginning, and they didn't feel that any side in the transportation network layer would be closer to their ideals. Therefore, they all appeared in the empty space between the two regions. However, as their incarnations entered the world of laws and saw the things that they were originally extremely familiar with, but had now completely disappeared after entering the transportation network layer, they clearly began to lean towards the side of the founders of the new world. Just like that, the faction of the New World's founder began to grow stronger and stronger. Although there was still a considerable gap between them and the Old World founders, they were still closing the gap and gradually reaching a balance. Facing this situation, the New World founders didn't pay much attention to it, but the Old World founders gradually began to have doubts. If one World founder felt that there was a problem, it might be an illusion. If 100 World founders felt that there was a problem, then what if 1,000, 10,000, or even 100,000 World founders felt the same? If that was the case, there probably wouldn't be many World founders who would treat it as an illusion, right? At the same time, the world pioneers who kept appearing in the transportation network layer joined the other side without any hesitation, firmly indicating that there was a problem. No matter how resolute they would unwittingly feel doubtful in their hearts. Different creators of the world naturally had different ways of dealing with such doubts. Some world founders directly extinguished such doubts and felt that there was no problem, while some world founders began to be skeptical and began to pay attention to the changes of the New World founders. Some, on the other hand, began to try and probe. However, for the Old World founders, because they had already given up on the embodiments they had sent into the world of laws, they couldn't follow the ideas of the New World founders and set off from the world of laws this time. They could use their embodiments to conduct research, explore, and probe the world of laws to achieve their goal of finding out the truth. At this time, they could only try to achieve the same goal by carrying out all kinds of modifications to their world, conducting more detailed research on it, and conducting all kinds of strange tests. Obviously, the difficulty of this task was far beyond their imagination. Even Luo Fan had to rely on the clones of the world's founders to barely make any progress. It went without saying how difficult it was for the world's founders to achieve such an effect by studying their own clones. It could even be said that it was almost an impossible task. After spending hundreds of millions of years in the world of laws, Luo Fan had unknowingly obtained some gains. When he vaguely grasped the traces of the influence of the upper world on the lower world, the world founders finally began to despair about this method. Once they were in despair, there were differences in the behavior of the world founders. Some of the creators of the world directly gave up on this goal and continued to study the possible influence and control hidden in the world. Some, on the other hand, had an outburst of inspiration and grasped a certain key point. They began to imitate Luo Fan's method and cooperated with the other world founders, sending their incarnations into each other's world. However, due to the problem of controlling the parallel worlds, the incarnations that the world founders sent into other worlds could not be arranged into different parallel worlds. Instead, they were all arranged in the source world. Under such circumstances, the worlds that they could cooperate with each other were naturally limited. In other words, there was a limit to the number of clones that could be accommodated in each world. After all, the incarnations of different world founders would definitely gradually cause greater and greater storms as they grew, and their influence on the world would become greater and greater. In that case, the influence caused by a small number of incarnations of world founders in a world could still be traced. Through this influence, one could discover what should and should not exist, what was normal and what was abnormal. However, when the number of incarnations reached a certain level, the influence caused by the incarnations and the storms they caused would interfere with each other. In the end, the situation in the world would become extremely chaotic. In the end, even the world founders would not be able to know the results of their influence, so it was naturally difficult for them to find the abnormalities. Of course, they were all world founders after all. Their control and perception of their own world was not something that ordinary living beings could imagine. Therefore, even if there was a limit to the number, the final amount would definitely reach an unbelievable level. As a result, every creator of the universe who came up with such a method was clearly extremely busy. As more and more world founders thought of this method, the communication in the entire transportation network layer became more frequent. With this change, the many worlds that were originally isolated actually became even more closely connected. The entire transportation network layer seemed to have truly turned into a huge continent. With this influence, the various worlds' characteristics, principles, and all the things that were developed from the world founders' worldviews gradually began to influence each other. Under this change, the roads in the entire transportation network layer became more and more numerous. The complexity of the entire transportation network layer also began to become more and more astonishing. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan saw it, and he secretly felt that the world was unpredictable. Perhaps the world founders were wholeheartedly trying to find the influence that their world had on them, but this kind of effort was actually constantly deepening the influence. After all, the transportation network layer was almost completely derived from Luo Fan's will, his own understanding, and his own concept. Under such circumstances, the more complicated the entire transportation network layer became, the more roads there were, and the more perfect the structure of the entire network was. This meant that his concept and understanding would be more strongly implemented. This kind of implementation would naturally have an effect on those heavens and earth. Then, it would start to influence and change those heavens and earth. This would also allow his control and influence over the heavens and earth to grow stronger and stronger. Of course, perhaps this method was indeed beneficial for the world founders to discover his control and influence. After all, the stronger the control and influence, the harder it would be to hide, and there would naturally be more and more clues. The more clues there were, the easier it would be for the world founders to discover them. However, if the world founders knew about this influence, they would probably not be willing to accept it. Fortunately, I didn't think of this back then. Otherwise, it would have been even more difficult for me to break free now. Luo Fan let out a long breath and finally recovered from the exploration process that had lasted for who knows how many trillions of years. At this moment, the traces of clues that he found had vaguely pointed to the Great Path. It was pointing to the Great Path that was the core, the foundation, and the inseparable place of this world. That influence was extremely subtle and mysterious. Even now, he still felt that it was very vague, and he couldn't even be sure if his perception was correct or if there were any omissions. But all the information and factors that he had obtained now ultimately pointed to the Great Path. This situation made him understand that it was much more difficult for him to break free from the influence and control that might exist. It was much more difficult than he had imagined. Following this feeling, Jia Jelly released his perception and began to think of a higher level of exploration. He began to search for the world that was controlling or rather affecting the world behind the scenes. This was almost like a blind man trying to find the location of the sun when he felt the heat on his body. This kind of effort could indeed produce some result. At the very least, it allowed him to find the direction of the sun. However, it was impossible to know how far away the sun was from him, how big the sun itself was, and what kind of incredible effect the sun would have if it truly released all of its power. Chapter 2744. How vast was the world? What exactly did it look like? Where was it located? What kind of existence was the creator of the world? And so on and so forth. All of this was a secret that was difficult to see through for Luo Fan. It could be said that to him, seeing this clearly was merely confirming that there was indeed a world above his world of laws that was affecting and even controlling it. As expected, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this moment. His emotions were rather complicated at this moment. He felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders, but there was also an indescribable pressure acting on his heart. The situation in front of him clearly meant that his previous speculation about the structure of the simulated state of chaos was correct. And what was that structure? It was a pyramid-like structure. In other words, the world that had survived more great tribulations of the world would influence and even control a large portion of the world that had survived fewer great tribulations of the world. This continued until the world that had survived 9 great tribulations of the world. In other words, above Luo Fan's world of laws, there were worlds that had survived 3 great tribulations of the world that were influencing his world of laws. And above the world that had survived 3 great tribulations of the world, there were worlds that had survived 4 great tribulations of the world that were influencing and even controlling this world. There was a 5th great tribulations above the 4th, and a 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th great tribulations above the 5th. In this way, it could be seen that there were a total of 7 great tribulations of the world of laws, be it directly or indirectly. Moreover, the higher the influence of these great tribulations of the world of laws, the more obscure it was, the deeper it was, and the more absolute it was. If Luo Fan wanted to completely break free from this influence and this control, then his opponent, his enemy, was the heaven and earth of the 7th layer that had passed through the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It was easy to imagine how terrible the situation was for him. With these thoughts in mind, Luo Fan finally erased all kinds of negative emotions in an instant, and a strong fighting spirit emerged from the depths of his heart. No matter what, I must break free. With this thought in mind, he no longer hesitated. Perhaps for the countless worlds in the simulated state of chaos, their worldview and the absolute independence of their own world did not matter. After all, to them, the simulated state of chaos was, in fact, the state of chaos. The fact that they were here meant that they had reached the peak of cultivation. Everything that they would encounter next would be considered a normal process of cultivation in the state of chaos. It could even be considered a normal restriction. Under such circumstances, it was not unacceptable to be influenced by the higher levels of heaven and earth that had survived more great tribulations. If there was really no way to cut it off, however, for Luo Fan, the situation was completely different. To him, simulating the state of chaos was just simulating the state of chaos. No matter what, it was just a relatively grand existence that was born from his great tribulation. All the achievements and encounters here were ultimately just a simulation of the true state of chaos. Moreover, it was completely targeted at him. It was to attack him and affect his simulation. If he were to accept the influence of this place, and accept the changes in the simulated state of chaos, it would mean that he was not qualified to survive this tribulation. It would also mean that he had failed the 7th Great Tribulation, and this kind of failure obviously meant that he would never be able to reincarnate. It meant that his soul would scatter and his body would perish. Just thinking about it, he knew that it was absolutely impossible to accept this kind of thing. Therefore, he absolutely abhorred this kind of influence. Since he hated it so much, there was naturally no other choice for him to make. At this time, the only thing he could do was obviously to muster his courage and rush towards the 7 levels of heaven and earth. He wanted to cut off the layers of shackles that the 7 levels of heaven and earth had placed on his world of laws, directly affecting the great Tao. He murmured as his eyes directly arrived at the great Tao in his world of laws. This great Tao was like a long river that flowed endlessly. There were endless principles, endless mysteries, and endless incredible and subtle information within it. Here, all the principles of the universe seemed to be contained, and all the mysteries of the universe seemed to originate from here. Although this great Tao originated from Luo Fan's world of laws, when Luo Fan looked at this great Tao, he still felt that it was unfathomable. He vaguely felt that it contained many mysteries that he couldn't understand or discover. This wasn't strange. The creation of heaven and earth seemed to be the creation of everything in this world. But in fact, the act of creating heaven and earth was only in accordance with a certain method. It was based on one's own worldview, one's own ability, and one's own power to carry out a certain definition. In other words, the method of creating heaven and earth seemed to be completely the act of a cultivator, but in fact, there were many incredible and subtle forces involved in it. At the very least, the external environment would have all kinds of influences that were difficult to cut off. Here, even the simulated state of primal chaos was also a part of the creation. If it was in the state of chaos, it would also participate in the creation of the world. If it was in another great world, a perfect world would naturally be a great world, and a perfect world would also participate in the creation. In fact, when a world was created within one's body, the various origins contained in one's body, as well as the indescribable fundamental laws and fundamental principles within one's body, would also participate in it. Moreover, after this kind of creation, the great Tao was also not fabricated out of thin air. Instead, it was based on all of this and carried out all kinds of subtle and indescribable combinations. In this way, even if it was a grand Tao that was created when the world was split apart, it contained profundities that even the creator of the grand Tao didn't know about and couldn't understand, and that was extremely normal. However, even though he could not understand or even know its profundities, the creator was the creator. His natural authority was enough to allow him to perform countless operations on the great Tao. Even if he said that he had complete control over the great Tao, it would not be inaccurate. Any creator of the universe was well aware of this point, and Luo Fan naturally understood it completely. It's a pity that everything contained in the great Tao is based on my worldview. Otherwise, it would be easier for me to perfect my worldview by relying on this absolute control to comprehend the great Tao. Looking at the great Tao, Luo Fan started to sigh with emotion for the umpteenth time. One must know that although the great Tao was mysterious and unfathomable, everything within it was based on his worldview. Even if the external environment joined in, even if there were the participation of the various laws and powers of the external world, the root of everything was still his worldview. Because it came from his worldview, in the end, it was deduced back through the great Tao. After everything that had nothing to do with the worldview was removed, what was left was only his worldview. In such a situation, for other creators and existences who wanted to absorb nutrients from the great Tao, comprehending the great Tao was naturally a great harvest. However, for the owner of this world, it was obviously completely different. To him, comprehending the great Tao was like learning from himself and asking for guidance. Doing a little of this kind of thing would be a great harvest. It could allow the creator to understand himself better, familiarize himself, and even recognize some of his weaknesses. Only then could he think about how to make up for it. However, if he always treated this as his cultivation method and took it as a way for him to improve, it would naturally be a joke. After sighing with emotion, Luo Fan began to analyze the great Tao in detail. Comprehending the great Tao in the world that he had opened up could not really make him grow much. However, his goal at this moment was not to grow. Instead, he wanted to find the influence that the world that was like a huge shadow that shrouded his world had on the great Tao. This kind of analysis was not easy. Even if it was the great Tao that he had created, even if he had almost absolute control over the great Tao, even if he could command the great Tao as he pleased, it was unimaginably difficult to analyze the various details within the great Tao. This was just like how an ordinary person could operate his own computer. He could naturally operate his own computer. Even if he wanted to smash his own computer, it was all up to him. As for what he wanted his computer to play, what to open, what to calculate, what to play, and so on, it was all up to him. However, did this mean that he knew what was inside the computer? Did this mean that he knew what was inside the computer? Did this mean that the many components inside the computer were operating on what principles? If someone were to insert a new part into the computer, would he really be able to find it in the first place? This was obviously impossible, at least, it was impossible for most ordinary people. But now, Luo Fan was equivalent to that computer user. The great Tao in front of him was like that computer. To him, whatever he wanted to do with this great Tao was just a matter of a thought. Even if he wanted to make this great Tao collapse and completely destroy this world, he only needed a single thought to do it. However, wanting to analyze this great Tao was like a computer user trying to understand the principles of all the components inside the computer. The difficulty of this was self-evident. Of course, compared to the great Tao of other worlds, this kind of authority was still much more convenient for him. For example, at this moment, many details of the great Tao had already unfolded in front of his eyes due to his will. The connections between the many great Tao, the many mysteries, the connections between many principles, the way they interchanged with each other, and even the places where they conflicted with each other were revealed little by little at this moment. Even if this great Tao came from him, even if it came from his worldview, the complexity of its changes was far beyond the scope of his imagination. His worldview was already extremely huge, and the concepts and knowledge within it were probably calculated in the trillions. However, the corresponding changes produced by each concept and point of knowledge in this great Tao would only be hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times more than the concepts and knowledge in this worldview. In other words, if every concept and point of knowledge was really abstracted, it could almost be considered an incomparably huge worldview. Moreover, this alone couldn't even describe the terrifying number. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to find something that didn't belong to him among the countless mysteries of the great Tao and was the influence of a higher world. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if his mind was about to explode from the endless information, and his entire thinking became slightly sluggish under the endless information. Fortunately, there was a heavenly Tao in his world of laws, and there were countless incarnations of the heavenly Tao controlling everything. Otherwise, just his current state alone would have been enough to cause all kinds of chaos in his world of laws. But even so, the incarnations of the countless world founders in his world of laws could faintly sense the abnormality of this world. All kinds of things that were impossible in the past began to occasionally appear in many parallel places of this world. All kinds of things that should have appeared also unknowingly disappeared between heaven and earth. What's happening? Is he up to something? At this moment, all kinds of inexplicable doubts arose in the hearts of the incarnations of the world founders, and they only felt a sense of uneasiness in their hearts. Whether or not they were abandoned by their main bodies, and whether or not there were incarnations that were connected to their main bodies, this world was already closely related to their lives. For the incarnations that had been abandoned by their main bodies, they were independent individuals, and everything in this world was everything to them. Any changes in this world would naturally affect everything to them. Under such circumstances, if there were any changes in this world that they couldn't control, it would naturally cause their death. Chapter 2745. The attitudes of the many founders towards the various changes that were happening in the central world of laws were rather complicated. They were both worried and expectant. They were naturally worried that the changes that were happening in the central world of laws would be difficult for them to distinguish between good and bad. If they were not careful, it might cause them an unimaginable impact and cause them to suffer a huge loss. It would make their own world and their own situation even worse. On the other hand, they were expectant because no matter when, the changes that appeared in Luo Fan's central world of laws could be said to be trend-setting for them. There would definitely be some kind of revelation that would allow them to strengthen their understanding of the various worlds, the simulated state of chaos, and many other aspects. How could they not look forward to the possibility of such benefits? The complicated emotions of worry and expectation filled the hearts of many founders at this time, causing them to look at the central world of laws with various subtle changes. Luo Fan naturally did not care about such changes. Ever since these worlds were connected to the transportation network layer, they no longer posed any threat to him. No matter what these worlds wanted to do, even if they wanted to directly attack the central world of laws, it would be impossible for them to succeed as long as they could not transcend the transportation network layer. After all, there were countless worlds in the transportation network layer. After so many worlds were connected to the transportation network layer, although Luo Fan could not have complete and absolute control over them, he was already qualified to use a considerable part of their power. When the power of these many worlds was gathered together, the total amount was obviously far greater than that of a single world. In this way, in terms of power alone, a single world was extremely powerless. Moreover, the worlds within the transportation network layer were already greatly controlled by Luo Fan, and it was naturally difficult for them to mobilize their power to fight against the world of laws with such confidence. How could Luo Fan possibly focus his precious attention on the many worlds in the transportation network layer at this time? At this moment, he was completely focused on dissecting the great Tao of the world of laws, breaking down and transforming the originally profound and complicated great Tao bit by bit, turning it into endless details that mixed in his heart in an extremely chaotic manner. Under his will, he began to make an extremely detailed comparison with his worldview of the world of laws. Although the great Tao was endless and contained endless subtle principles and mysteries that Luo Fan could not understand and comprehend, it still came from Luo Fan. However, in the end, it still originated from Luo Fan, from his worldview, and from all his past experiences. Under such circumstances, any profundities, principles, and details could naturally be found on the law's worldview, corresponding concepts, and corresponding cognition. It was naturally still impossible for him to comprehend everything in the great Tao one by one. However, if he wanted to find the source and the corresponding concepts and cognition that corresponded to the worldview, it wouldn't be too difficult. At this time, in his heart, countless details were constantly being traced, found corresponding points, and quickly eliminated. Just like that, time continued to pass. 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, unknowingly, tens of millions of years had passed in this world of laws. Compared to the transportation network layer, this period of time was only a few days. For the many founders of the transportation network layer, some of them still hadn't recovered from their guesses about what happened to Luo Fan and what exactly happened to the world of laws. At this moment, the world of laws suddenly trembled slightly, and an indescribable wave suddenly spread out from the world of laws. In a daze, many founders suddenly felt that the restraining ability of the transportation network layer on them seemed to have been strengthened in some way. In the past, the transportation network layer was just a simple transportation network layer to them. Its function was only to allow them to communicate with each other and give them a stage background. But now, the transportation network layer seemed to have changed from a stage background to a performer on the stage. It had become some kind of prison with shackles, a cage. Existing here felt like they were being restrained. The various subtle connections and subtle changes that they originally couldn't feel were given a new meaning at this time, making them feel uncomfortable. What's going on? This doubt that had appeared in their hearts for the umpteenth time appeared in their hearts at this time. With this thought in mind, they suddenly turned their gazes to the world of laws. The core of the transportation network layer was completely Luo Fan's world of laws. Under such circumstances, the most likely source of any abnormalities that happened here was naturally the world of laws that was the core. Under such circumstances, when they sensed the changes in the transportation network layer, they naturally thought of looking for it from the world of laws at the first possible moment. And soon, they discovered the reason. Naturally, it wasn't because they instantly saw through the world of laws, nor was it because there were changes in the world of laws that they could see at a glance. Instead, it was because they suddenly discovered that the world of laws was no longer the core of the transportation network layer. Behind the world of laws, or rather, beside the world of laws, there was an additional layer of fog. It was a fog that was difficult to detect and observe. It was somewhat similar to the subtle fog on the surface of the world of laws, but it was deeper and more unpredictable. And the reason why they said that the world of laws was no longer the core of the transportation network layer was even simpler. The moment they saw the fog, they suddenly had an indescribable feeling. This was the core of the transportation network layer. This was where everything in the transportation network layer would be decided. The shackles that bound them, the shackles that bound them, and the shackles that bound them came from the fog. In fact, their senses told them that there were also some kind of shackles acting on the world of laws from the fog. Why are we seeing this all of a sudden? At this moment, many of the world founders found it hard to understand. Although their understanding of the essence of the simulated state of chaos couldn't compare to Luo Fan's, they were still world founders after all. This level of cognition allowed them to clearly understand that everything they could see in this simulated state of chaos was actually closely related to their own cognition. And now, their cognition clearly hadn't changed. In their hearts, the world of laws was still the core of the transportation network layer, and the transportation network layer still didn't have much power to restrain them. However, it was under such circumstances that the transportation network layer they saw actually underwent such a change. How could they not be surprised by this situation? At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the world of laws, had an extremely solemn expression on his face. After spending tens of millions of years to thoroughly analyze the great Tao of the world of laws, he had finally found what he was looking for: the influence of the external existence on his world of laws. It was a strange shackle, a shackle that had extended out of nowhere and was acting on an extremely minute concept, an extremely minute cognition, in the world of laws of his world. This shackle locked onto his tiny concept and cognition, and through this concept and cognition, it continued to spread its influence to the entire great Tao, then to the entire world of laws, and then to everything that was affected by the world of laws. Although the shackles didn't have much of an impact on him now, it was only temporary. As time passed, the influence of the shackles would continue to grow stronger and stronger. In the end, it might really change his world of laws at some point in time, and then change his worldview, and then change his will. This situation was simply abhorrent to Luo Fan. The moment he discovered it, an indescribable killing intent arose in his heart. It was because of the strong killing intent that existed behind the shackle. This kind of shackle was actually quite mysterious. The shackle itself didn't just seem to be connected to a certain world, but it also seemed to have an extremely subtle connection with the tribulation level. It seemed like it wasn't just affected by the world behind it, but also by the tribulation level. With a slight change in his mind, Luo Fan understood that all these connections were actually quite natural. For any world, this kind of shackle would obviously change according to the number of times it had passed the tribulation of the world. For example, when it passed the first tribulation of the world, this kind of shackle would come from a world that had already passed the second tribulation of the world. If the world had passed the second tribulation of the world, then it would be like Luo Fan's world of laws. The shackle would come from a world that had already passed the third tribulation of the world. If the world passed the third tribulation of the world, then the world that the shackle came from would have to pass the fourth tribulation of the world, and so on and so forth. In order to achieve this transformation process, the tribulation level must have the ability to change some kind of shackle. Otherwise, how could the world behind the shackle be changed? However, there might be another possibility, which is that this kind of shackle doesn't actually come from a single world. Instead, it's made up of many shackles? Surviving a tribulation is equivalent to breaking a layer of the shackles and cutting off the connection between a layer and the world? Then, Luo Fan's thoughts changed and he thought of another possibility. However, this possibility also meant that the shackle could be affected by the tribulation level. Passing a tribulation meant breaking a certain layer of the shackle. If the tribulation level couldn't affect the shackle, how could it appear? And if it was the second possibility, then the difficulty of severing the shackles would be countless times more difficult than the first possibility. After all, if it was the first possibility, then the shackle he sensed was merely a shackle extended by a world that had passed the third tribulation of the world. Compared to his heaven and earth of laws, a world that had passed the third tribulation of the world might have gained one more benefit from the tribulation level, but he didn't think that it would be much stronger than his heaven and earth of laws. Although it wouldn't be easy to resist it, it wasn't impossible. However, if it was the second possibility, then the situation would be different. The second possibility meant that the core of this shackle might be an extension of a world that had passed more tribulations of the world. Perhaps it was emitted by the heaven and earth that had gone through 8 or even 9 heaven and earth tribulations. Even though he was confident that his worldview of laws was perfect, and that his heaven and earth of laws wouldn't be inferior to a world that had passed more tribulations of the world, he wasn't arrogant enough to think that his heaven and earth of laws could really compare to a world that had passed 8 or 9 tribulations of the world. There was no essential difference between severing the shackles of the second possibility and directly resisting the world that had survived the 8th or 9th Great Tribulation of the world. In this way, the difficulty of severing these shackles was self-evident. Faced with such a situation, the solemn expression on Luo Fan's face became even more obvious. Which possibility is it? Let me give it a try. With this thought in mind, he turned his head to look at the world outside the heaven and earth of laws that had locked him with the shackle. The reason why the many world founders in the transportation network could see the fog that appeared next to the heaven and earth of laws was, of course, because when Luo Fan discovered the shackle, he recognized the existence of the world behind the heaven and earth of laws that affected the heaven and earth of laws. Through this recognition, he determined the appearance of the world and even faintly connected it to the transportation network layer. Although all of this happened with Luo Fan as the transit, all the changes actually didn't shift according to Luo Fan's will. At the very least, it didn't happen because Luo Fan wanted it to happen. The reason why this world was just a fog in the eyes of the world founders and not the real appearance of the world was that it was only born because of Luo Fan, and the world itself didn't cooperate with him. This connection, or rather this connection, could be said to be one-sided. Please wait a moment. After the content is updated, you will need to refresh the page to get the latest updates. NT